One of them is live. The other one so far doesn't have a picture. There it is. I see some people here already. How are you guys doing today? We're going to be starting at 47 today. If anybody has any prayer requests, please don't hesitate to ask in the comments or questions or anything you want to talk about. And without further ado, here we go.
All right. So in verse 4 we have, or in verses 1 through 3, we find this news out that in chapter 14, guess what? At mid-trib, all the 144,000 are dead. Now that's a good thing for them, obviously. They're in heaven. And in verse 4, we're given the reason for their death. Actually, let me go back to verse 4 so you can see it. They were the first fruits for God. Now, what does that mean? Well, the concept of first fruits is found throughout Scripture, and the concept's actually pretty simple. During a reaping of produce in the field, the best fruit is typically the fruit you're going to harvest first. You've ever heard the phrase low-hanging fruit? Why is it low-hanging? Because it's big, it's heavy, it's ripe, it's ready. And it's not just that it's reachable. The fact that it's reachable is a consequence of its desirability. And so you take the best stuff first. Why would you leave it on the tree? It'll just rot. So the most ripe, best fruit comes down first. And in the law, the Lord called for Israel to give to the Lord an offering of first fruits. That is, the Lord deserves the first and the best in everything, including in the bounty of the land. And then when you think about it, He's the one giving the produce in the first place. You're just kind of giving it back to Him to acknowledge that He provided it. And so the concept of first fruits is this, taking it out of an agrarian context and just generalizing it for a minute. The concept of first fruits is the best goes first. The best goes first. That's what it means. And the best goes to the Lord. The best belongs to the Lord. All right, the best goes first. The best goes to the Lord. And so in verse 4, we're told that these men are such. They are the ones who follow Jesus everywhere. They are in heaven, so we know that obviously they've died. They have died before the second half of tribulation because we're still at mid-trib, which tells us they are the first martyrs. They are the best martyrs. They are for Jesus. They're His martyrs, so to speak. They aren't necessarily the very first people to die. I'm not saying that if you took all of humanity who has died up to this point, the first 144,000 that died are these men. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is they're the first group of any distinction to enter complete into heaven. They're the first finished group of martyrs, and they do it all in the first half of tribulation. So what made this privileged group the best and the first? Well, number one, they were the first to receive faith after the rapture. These were they brought faith back to earth. That is, by God's appointing, they were the first to believe on earth among a world of unbelievers. They were the first to spread the gospel. They were set apart from earthly pleasures like marriage so they could be dedicated to serving Jesus. They were single-minded in their task. In verse 5, we're told they never lie, which is a pretty powerful testimony for anyone, frankly. And now I'm not saying they were sinless, but it appears they lived on a level of like Paul or the other apostles. I mean, they had a sanctified lifestyle in a difficult time of life. So simply put, they were models of obedience and service, and they were the first to bring about a revival, if you will, to the earth. And then as an additional measure of grace for them, the Lord allowed them to be the first martyrs, and as such, they are removed from the earth before the Great Tribulation, before the second half of tribulation starts, which is worse than the first half. So although I suspect they were probably being killed throughout the first half, maybe at different points along the way, that probably reaches a crescendo once you get to the point of people having to take a mark. I'm sure we know these men did not take the mark, obviously. So at that point, they're probably quickly killed at the very end of the first half of tribulation. And now that all have been martyred, they're standing with Jesus in the heavenly Mount Zion, awaiting the end of tribulation. So a question arises at this point, especially if you remember chapter 7. If the 144,000 were sealed in chapter 7, you remember that? Then how is it they're being killed if they were sealed? Wouldn't that sealing have protected them? Wasn't that the whole point of the sealing? Back in chapter, let's see, where am I going here? Chapter 7. Here we go. Verse 2. It says, I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God, and he cried out with a loud voice to the 4 angels, to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the bondservants of our God on their foreheads. And what we said back then was that sealing, based in the context there, would indicate a supernatural prevention of harm from the disasters that were coming. I mean, it wouldn't make any sense, right? Save a bunch of guys, and then immediately all hell breaks loose on earth, and they all die, and there goes your evangelistic plan, right? It wouldn't have made sense for God to let that happen. So he is protecting them. Now, if you also remember, I told you from what we read in Revelation 6:6, when God said, as he's breaking the seals, he said, do not harm the oil and the wine. You remember I told you back then, those are classic pictures in Scripture of Israel. Olive oil, grapes for wine. And as such, it's a bit of a coded message. It wasn't intended to be as easy to understand to the plain eye. It was meant to be a coded message to someone who understands the depths of Scripture, to make clear that Israel, the land of Israel, will be excluded from the natural disasters of the first half of tribulation. It will be a safe harbor for the people of Israel while the rest of the world's being torn asunder. And what we're learning then is the 144,000 were sealed individually, while Israel itself was protected geographically, so that if the 144,000 had to venture outside the land of Israel, they would maintain their personal protection wherever they went. But Jews who stayed in Israel were protected in the land. Much like what God did to Goshen in the time of the Egyptian plagues, where Goshen was kept from experiencing the plagues during that period. All right, so now, though, the time has come for them to be martyred. And so, by logical deduction, God removes the sealing. That is, he now permits their death. It's the same analog to the 2 witnesses. For 3.5 years, nobody can touch them. As soon as the Lord was ready for that to end, the beast is able to kill them. It's the same thing here again. I mean, these guys were not going to live forever. They were going to die at some point. So the whole point is to make a use of them to a point and then to see the end of them when it's ready, when God is ready. What would it say to us then that God is ready for 144,000 evangelists, the chief evangelists of earth for that matter? What does it say to us that he's ready for them to die? What it tells us plainly is that the time for evangelism has come to an end. That it's a highly symbolic move. It's telegraphing God's intent. If these guys all die, it must mean he's done with that phase. He's done with that work. Remember back in chapter 13, we read this. If anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. Here's the perseverance and the faith of the saints. That is, God has purposed to allow believers to experience, among other things, martyrdom. And the first fruits of that martyrdom will be the 144,000. And by their example, and you see this now from front to back, by their example of faith, they became evangelists for the rest of the world. By their example of martyrdom, that is, going to death in faith, going to death in perseverance, they set the example now for the second half of tribulation. They set the example for the first half by coming to faith. They set the example for the second half by dying a good death and not trading their faith, recanting as it might happen for some out of fear. Back in chapter 12, we were told that the mid-trib period would include believers beginning to die rather than bending their knee to Satan. We studied that. Here, verse 10, this is from chapter 12, I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even when they faced death. That will be the new reality. So the martyring of 144,000 is one of several signs we've seen and we'll see again that tell us that the opportunity to be saved by the grace of God has come to an end on earth. You are a believer at this point, or you are not. The ones who are believing will be martyred, most of them. The ones who are not believing will take the mark and never have an opportunity to believe. There are only some very small exceptions to that, which we will cover later. So the undecided column is quickly dropping to 0 at mid-trib. So who is left to save at this point? That is to say, if you believe, for argument's sake, that evangelism hasn't ended, as I'm telling you that it does, well, all right, play that out for a minute. Who's getting saved at this point? Who is being evangelized and who is doing the evangelism? The saved at this point who believe are now being persecuted mercilessly, and many of them are dying. And to make yourself known as someone who has not taken the mark is to basically put a bullseye on your back, more so than it has ever been true on earth before. And who are you trying to reach even if you are going out? Everyone who does not believe at that point has been told take the mark or die. How many of them do you think are still floating around yet to take the mark? I'm not talking among those who have a strong religious opinion like Orthodox Jews. I'm saying put aside those. I'm talking about among those who have no dog in the fight. Why would they not be taking the mark? I mean, you might imagine that a few don't, but I'm telling you that's a pretty slim imagination, because at this point it's die or take the mark, and they think the Antichrist is God. Why wouldn't they take his mark? So just playing it out, there's really no one to be evangelized at this point who isn't already staking their claim to God in some other form, that isn't already evangelized. The only exception would be the Orthodox Jews. Meanwhile, the Lord isn't done with evangelism. That is to say, he was done with human evangelism. But the Lord offers one final opportunity for the world in Revelation 14:6. It says, I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven, having an eternal gospel to preach to those who live on the earth, and every nation and tribe and tongue and people. And he said with a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and the springs of waters. All right, so John sees another angel. He's flying in mid-heaven. Now remember, mid-heaven is simply the biblical way of saying the atmosphere, the actual sky. And the last time you saw an angel flying in mid-heaven was when we saw the angel announcing to the world that the 3 woe judgments were about to start. And here you have another heavenly declaration. This time he's preaching an eternal gospel to the world, John says. He calls it an eternal gospel because it's the very same message that has always been preached. There has only ever been one way to be saved. There has only ever been one plan of salvation. There has only ever been one message, one gospel, period. Now, the details of that message have expanded over time as God has revealed more of it to people, right? So it got more specific over time. But the thrust of the message never changed. The basic message itself was there from the very beginning, from Adam and woman in the garden to Noah, to Abraham, to Moses, to Samuel, to David, to the apostles, from Abel to Zechariah. They all had the same message in varying portions and ways, as the writer of Hebrews says. And that message has always been summed up as the righteous will live by faith. And here you have an angel delivering it one last time to the world of this age. And in this case, he declares that the window's closing, salvation train is leaving the station, time's running out, the hour of judgment has come. And when you see the word hour used in a context like this, it just means a very short time. It's not literally 60 minutes. It just means the time of salvation is very short now. So don't fear the Antichrist, don't fear physical death, fear the Lord, and trust him who made all things. And then that angelic declaration, having now been given, is the final presentation of the gospel to the entire world by anyone prior to Christ's coming. This is it. And it's further proof that there is no longer any human evangelism taking place. Why? Because once God has made a pronouncement, you notice, to every tribe, nation, and tongue, it says in the text, no one was excluded from this, and it came from the mouth of an angel directly. There's a principle in Scripture that typically, or I would say generally, God does not allow a lesser messenger to find success with a message when a greater messenger has previously failed at that same effort. So when Jesus delivers the gospel to someone in their hearing, then that person will not be able to receive the gospel from an apostle later. And when an apostle sends the gospel to somebody, typically you will not see that same person receive it from a lesser messenger later. Now, I'm not saying there aren't exceptions, but what I am saying is that's a general principle, because it dishonors the greater for the sake of the lesser. And in this case, you now have God speaking through an angelic messenger to literally every human being of the gospel. What more do you want? And at this point, it's the capstone. It's really the punctuation mark on the whole of God's effort in this period. And that's why the angel says the hour is short. This is it. Take it or leave it. And then to make sure and by the way, this is a fulfillment of something you've read elsewhere in the Gospels. And sometimes it's this passage I'm about to show you is sometimes misinterpreted to suggest that we today have an obligation to reach every human being, and if we don't, reach everyone with the sound of the gospel, the hearing of the gospel, Jesus can't come back. And have you ever heard this? From Matthew 24? When Jesus says, speaking of the end times, he says, lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. And some who just don't understand the context properly have come to believe that means that if we aren't sending missionaries to every last corner of the earth, which, by the way, is a perfectly fine thing to do, but they see it as a necessity before Jesus can come back. And every time some new baby is born in some deep, dark, unreached care part of the world, we set Jesus' plan back by another day. And I realize that's not how they would literally say it, but that's the implication. Well, now you understand how Jesus intends to see this fulfilled. Remember, God doesn't need our help. He uses us. That's to our own benefit. That's to our blessing that we're involved in His work. But He doesn't need us. So how is He going to preach to the whole world? Well, He'll certainly use humanity to reach people, and that's self-evident. But when the time comes to finally check that box, He doesn't waste time waiting for us to get around to it. He puts an angel in the sky, says it loud enough everyone can hear it, box checked. The whole gospel is preached, and then the end will come, which is in keeping with the timing here. It also reminds us, by the way, that evangelism never has been nor ever will be dependent on human beings. This one passage, I would argue, forever negates and renders irrelevant any question or objection that you can raise about how God might save somebody that you might imagine somewhere else on the planet. That is, you ever had that conversation about, what about the natives in the jungle who've never heard of Jesus? This statement negates and makes irrelevant that concern. It simply demonstrates that if God wants to reach someone, He has ample ability to do so. That is, there will never be a time at any time in the future of the universe or eternity when we sit around saying, oh, it's a shame we didn't talk to so-and-so, otherwise they'd be here right now, or it's a shame that God didn't get to that planet, part of the planet, or we would have missed those people. No. Paul was reached without anyone talking to him. Other people have been reached without any human being talking to them. Angels can preach from heaven when the time comes. God can wash a bottle up on the shores when He wants to. He can drop a book from an airplane when He wants to. He can do anything He wants to, and He can when He's ready. No one will be unreached simply because they were too far from New York City or some other civilized, semi-civilized place. All right, anyway. When these people... by the way, I would also say this. I say this all the time. If you're the kind of person who throws that out a lot or has tended to do that, what about all these people that God hasn't talked to yet? They're on the other side of the planet. Well, if that's on your mind, maybe that's a sign you're supposed to be part of that solution. Get in the boat and go over there. I mean, I'm not saying that facetiously. I'm saying if that's that heavy on your heart, maybe that's a sign. You need to go talk to some people. All right, back to the text, verse 8. Another angel, a second one, followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality. Then another angel, a third one, followed, saying with a loud voice, If anyone worships the beast and his image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of His anger, and he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. They have no rest, day and night, those who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. All right, so we thought it was pretty cool that He gives us an angel telling us about the gospel. Well, He didn't stop there. he says to the earth through a second angel that and speaking about the enemy and about his kingdom on earth, he says, fallen, fallen is Babylon. Now, this is the first mention of the city name, Babylon, in the text of Revelation. As you've already seen with some other topics, when the topic really matters, it tends to get a lot of focus for a period of time, and it will come in pieces over a series of chapters, like the beast, as we've seen already, or other key issues like the 144,000. Well, Babylon is another of these major topics that will get a lot of attention through multiple chapters of the book. This is the first mention of it. It's very brief in passing. It really comes to bear in chapters 17 and 18. So when we get into that part, we'll really deal with what it means to be Babylon and all that comes with it. For now, we're just going to set it aside. But it's a reference to the Antichrist's kingdom. I can tell you that much, at least for now. And so he says, the second angel says, fallen is Babylon the Great. You might see it mid-trib, this ascendant Antichrist, this growing power and savior to the world, but you need to know he's as good as fallen. He won't survive. That's a sign to the world. Don't bet on him. You'll be betting on the wrong horse. And then a third angel. And the third angel says, if you bet on that horse, that is, if you take the mark of the beast, you're going to be part of the crowd tormented forever. There is no second chance for anyone with the mark of the beast because, frankly, there's no source of truth after this moment. That is, even if you were to say, well, you can take the mark and then erase it later, but who's going to make them want to do that? There's no source of truth on earth anymore. There's no one preaching the gospel. There's no church on the corner anymore. There's no movement of people toward the truth. It's done. So God himself, having preached by means of an angel, there are no longer any human messengers being used. No more evangelism. So the fate of every person on earth is sealed at mid-trib. That is with only a few exceptions, which I keep saying we'll cover. Moreover, for those who take the mark and put themselves out of reach in that sense, they join anyone else who dies without faith, as throughout history. I mean, everyone from Cain onward who has died without any redemption, they all exist in the same state. That is punishment that is eternal and terrible. And in verse 10, we have one of the most detailed descriptions of it, actually, in the whole Bible. The specific judgment is said to be of burning and suffering in torment. Those who die absent faith are suffering the wrath of God, it says, for their sin, in intense heat, day and night, without rest. And some start to feel nervous and uncomfortable at this point when you hear this because you wonder, well, even someone who does the worst things should be able to pay that debt off after a while. I mean, why is it forever? That seems like it's not fitting the crime in their sin. Well, you've missed the point of it then. Because suffering without end is because they are forever in a sinful state. They suffer not as a result of what they did, but as a result of who they are. They're not being born again, so they're not going to change. So they're still in a state of sin. That means every moment of every day, they're still sinning. They're just sinning there instead of here. So the sin never ends, so the state of suffering never ends. There's no return from that. That's the problem.
Hello. Hey, Heidi. No, that doesn't line up with Scripture at all. Revelation doesn't say that it happens at the Antichrist's birth. And in fact, it doesn't even mention his birth. What it does say, though, is the Antichrist will be revealed when he confirms a covenant with many and exalts himself in the temple. And, the rapture, as we know, is imminent, could happen any time. Yeah, it definitely, that isn't biblical. Hello, Matt. How are you doing today? What sounds like Elon? I'm going to get the next one going. That was session 47, so we'll be carrying on to 48. Oh, I thought that was kind of silly, but then I thought, maybe. But actually, I don't think he would have ever. There's been interviews where he's kind of alluded to Christianity being right or true or whatever. So, and the Antichrist will never do any of that. So I'm not sure, but I don't think it's Elon. And for anybody who's confused, I have 2 live streams going and I am responding to one in one of them.
So they suffer in the presence, it says, of the angels and the Lamb of God, which is a bit of a provocative thought. I don't know exactly how that works out, but I think it has something to do with where the location is relative in the kingdom. There's references in the Old Testament texts of Isaiah and Ezekiel, among others, that the place of the pit, the entrance to it, is visible during the kingdom, and smoke comes up from that pit the whole time, such that we could go see it in the kingdom, and that pit, endless smoke coming up in the kingdom, is going to be visible in the time that we live there. It's actually going to be located in present-day southern Jordan. Anyway, in recent time, you might know it's become fashionable to proclaim that there is no hell. You know, those who might tell you they know something of the Bible, or that a loving God wouldn't punish people like this, or that God gives us a second chance after death, or that we just don't exist after we die, anything at all to negate this reality. And this is one of the clearest passages you can take them to, that it is burning forever, doesn't end, day and night. It's not a cessation of existence. It doesn't have any time limit on it. And while I might be willing, I guess, to empathize with someone who feels like this just feels too strong, too bad, too hard to imagine, the reality is Scripture is abundantly clear. The nature, the duration is there. Unbelievers face what is described here. And what's so ironic about those false teachers who would try to convince you of otherwise, about hell and whatever they might say about these things, they, in what they're doing, they are contributing to the plight of these people, because they are removing perhaps the one incentive that God Himself might use in converting them to the truth. And if you want proof that this is a method of God, just look at what He's doing here. One of the statements He makes through an angel is, believe, and another statement He makes through another angel is, or go to hell. And if we're so worried about what hell must mean for somebody who's there, the right response to that is not to diminish the reality of hell. It's to incorporate that message in an appropriate way in the things we say to people who don't know Jesus. So I take it as a very clear sign that a false teacher is not saved when they say that hell doesn't exist, because they're actually working against the gospel itself at that point. They're removing the need for it. And as such, I think they've told you more about their heart than they're telling you about your future. All right, Peter says this about such people, and then we'll move on. Peter says, false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will also be false teachers among you, who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. Many will follow their sensuality, and because of them the way of the truth will be maligned, and in their greed they will exploit you with false words. Their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. How ironic that hell's very purpose in existing is to accommodate those who tell you today that it doesn't exist. All right, back to Revelation 14, verse 12. Here is the perseverance of the saints who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Right, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes," says the Spirit, "so they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow with them." So in verse 12, now I want you to notice the text here for a moment. Verse 12, John says, here's the perseverance of the saints. But now notice, this verse is not a quote. And then before that you had an angel speaking in verse 11, speaking to the world. And then in verse 13, you see a voice from heaven picking up again. So in verse 12, it's not either an angel or a voice from heaven, it's John. So it's commentary by John on what is happening around him. And the commentary is, he's saying the perseverance of saints is this, that is, the way a saint will maintain their hope in the circumstances that they're facing, this difficult time that's now about to start. How do they maintain their hope? John says, here's how you maintain your hope during the last 3.5 years. You do that by dying. That is, by understanding that dying is a blessing at this point in history. That's your hope. So that those who die in the Lord will have been released from living in a horrific, sinful world in which everyone wants to kill them. And they will have rested beyond that from the burden of trying to escape the enemy. And think about this, they're resting from surviving on meager supplies of food and water because they can't buy anything, and they're hiding. I mean, it's miserable for whatever time they live, of dealing with sickness, of dealing with weak bodies, of whatever uncertainty lies around the corner, the fear of the next morning. All of that is gone when they die. And the hope of all believers in that day will be the rest that death brings. And I should add, by the way, that though our life here might not seem quite so bad as theirs, and certainly it isn't, in effect, that's the same for us. That is, the hope, when you hear the Bible talk about the hope of the believer, modern teaching and its vapidness and biblical illiteracy tends to put its own thought into words. What does faith mean? What does hope mean? They make it what they want it to mean. But the Bible has a clear meaning in everything it says. And the hope of the Christian is not some ambiguous desire that you can make whatever you want. It's a very specific thing in the Bible. The hope of the Christian is resurrection. When the Bible talks about our hope, it's in the knowledge that the death of our body is not the end of us. That's a real hope in the face of the alternative. So, what is it to have a hope of Christianity? The hope of Christianity is I get to live again forever. All right. So, what is the perseverance of a saint? The perseverance of a saint is to maintain a hopeful, faithful witness when the world is making that harder and harder and harder, even at the threat of your own death. How do you persevere against that and not retreat? That is, recant or hide or do something to dishonor your witness. Well, you persevere by knowing death is not my enemy. I don't have to fear it. It's a good thing. That turns the whole thing 180 degrees. Rather than let the idea of death draw me away from a good witness, death being a blessing draws me toward a better witness because I don't mind it. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. And then there's this mention of their deeds follow after them. And this actually raises a very interesting aspect to why death is a blessing for them. Now, the mention of deeds should trigger for you immediately an understanding of what that's a reference to, right? That's a reference to eternal reward. That in persevering during difficult times, you are earning treasure. And conversely, do poorly in those same circumstances and you lose opportunity for something that God may have appointed to you as a reward for your perseverance. So persevering has a reward. But here's the interesting thing. When do you get your reward? Well, not until you're in the kingdom. That is, you know of what it will be when you move into the heavenly realm, but you don't actually receive it till you get back here on earth with Jesus because it has material form. It's part of something on earth. You get it in the kingdom. So before they die, they're suffering in a world they have nothing in, and they're being persecuted. After they die, not only are they escaping the burden of it and receiving rest in those things, but they have entered into a resurrected state. When the kingdom begins, they will be resurrected, as we will be also, because we'll have already been taken from the earth at the rapture. But when you're resurrected, it means you're in your eternal form. You're done. You're finished. You're set for all eternity. And you'll be entering into a kingdom as a resurrected body, which means, among other things, you receive your reward. And on top of that, because you're resurrected and glorified, you participate in the government, which we'll talk more about. But let me just give you a flavor of this. I'm going somewhere I need to help you understand with this verse. In Revelation 20, and again, we're dropping into the middle of this, so just hold that. We'll come back to the whole context later, but just look at this one moment. John says, I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them, and I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded. Now listen, the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and not received the mark on their forehead and their hand. Which ones are we talking about? The perseverance. These are the saints who persevered into death, okay? And what was true about them, he says, they came to life and they reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. So, Believers who live to the end of tribulation, who do not die, who do not receive the blessing of death during the tribulation, what happens to them? Well, they live to the end. They're believers. They will go into the kingdom, but they go in with their natural bodies, the same ones you and I have right now. They haven't died. They haven't been resurrected. They just walk right in. We'll talk more about that later. That's not the only time I'm giving you a preview of some of these things. But the consequence of that is they don't have their reward yet. And they don't rule in the government. They take a different place in society, which we'll cover. But those of us who have died prior to the kingdom, have been resurrected, are now in a state in which we participate with Jesus in the reigning of his government. The government of Jesus in the kingdom will be perfect. You can't have sinful people in the government, unlike today where it's a prerequisite. And so the believer that comes in natural and sinful can't participate in the government. They're the ones being ruled over because of their sin. It is the sinless people that have a place in the government because we can act in keeping with Jesus' requirements in perfection. So why is death a blessing? You escape the antichrist and the terrors of that time. You receive your reward and you enter into the kingdom glorified. All the other poor suckers who live through it all and then just come in their natural bodies, they're a step behind the whole way. Now eventually they do as well get resurrected. There's a place for everyone eventually. But the point is, it's a blessing to die during the tribulation for all of those reasons. And so to know that is perseverance because you have no reason to avoid it, everything to gain for it. And in fact, martyrdom will be the norm. Verse 14. And then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap is come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. And then he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. All right, I'm going to take a minute to describe these two characters, and then we'll get through it more quickly. It's not hard to see what's happening here. You have one who's on a cloud who looks like the Son of Man, has a sickle in his hand, and at the command of an angel, that one swung his sickle and reaped the earth. Now, who are these people? Well, John says the one who sits on the cloud is like a son of man, and is immediately, that phrase, being messianic in most cases, makes us think, okay, this is Christ. There are several details, though, in this scenario that undermine that conclusion. First, this man has a golden crown on his head, but
Hey, I'm going to continue playing the video, but I just want to let you know I will respond in a few minutes. I'm helping my little boy right now. I will be back.
the Greek word used here for crown is Stephanos. Now, if you remember the differences between the Stephanos and diadem we talked about earlier in this study, but the Greek word for Stephanos is not the kind of crown that you put on a king. In fact, the next time you see Jesus described in this book, in the action of of Revelation, is in chapter 19. And look what it said about him there. His eyes are a flame of fire, and on his head are many crowns, or in this case, the Greek word diadem. Diadem is the crown of a king, not a Stephanos. So, in this case, we have someone wearing a Stephanos. That doesn't fit the pattern of Jesus. He's not earned the crown. He is the king. And then, secondly, the one on the cloud, this Son of Man, he takes an order from an angel. I mean, that seems very unlikely that the Lord in his glorified form would take a command from an angel. And then third, that angel gives the command, and John, when he describes that angel, notice he says, and another angel. Now, another could just mean this is another angel like the ones we've heard in earlier chapters. But in the context, I think it means the first guy was an angel also, and so is this other guy. Why he chose to describe the first one as like a son of man, maybe it's an archangel. Maybe it's a different style of angel. In any event, it becomes clear, I think, as you go through the text that they're all angels. Jesus describes a moment in chapter 24 of Matthew in which he's speaking of the last days in this time of history, and he talks about a reaping of the earth. When he says that reaping takes place, look how he says it's done. He says in Matthew 24:31, he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, to be fair, this is a slightly different moment than the one we're looking at in Revelation 14, but I'm just making a reference here as a point. It's a pattern. God uses angels as messengers. He uses angels as reapers. Jesus himself is not the grim reaper. So it appears as though these are angels in both cases. Okay, so the angels are reaping here. And by the way, there's also a confirmation from Luke 16, now that I think about it, because in Luke 16, Jesus describing Lazarus and the rich man both dying, the believer is brought to the good place, escorted by angels. So that would seem to indicate that when we die, when believers die, angels move us from this world into the heavenly realm. All right. Anyway, remember what Daniel told us would be true about this time? Looking now at the issue of reaping specifically. When Daniel spoke about the last half of tribulation, here's what he told us. He says, speaking of the Antichrist, he says, as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones and will subdue 3 kings. Okay, we've seen all that. Verse 25, he will speak out against the Most High, and here, notice, and wear down the saints of the highest one. And he will intend to make alterations in times and law, and they, meaning the saints, will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. Now, this is that external reference that I'm using to tell you that this is a mid-trib chapter. Because I believe what Daniel's describing here is the same reaping that we are now seeing described in chapter 14. And Daniel says this reaping will happen for 3.5 years, which is my way of saying, or my indication that we're looking at something starting here at mid-trib for the second half. In other words, the second half of tribulation is martyrdom. Martyrdom, martyrdom, martyrdom. And what you have is the Lord, by agency of angels, collecting all of those who he says are now ripe for gathering. And the mechanism of their death is the Antichrist and his minions. But the point is, it's God in heaven saying, time to start collecting these people. And they start coming up to heaven in a mass martyrdom phase, 3.5 years of the Antichrist just wiping out believers. They've been given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. Okay? But as the angels go about their reaping, we get a little sign here at the end of Revelation that it's not a one-sided story or a one-sided battle. Chapter 17, and another angel came out of the temple, chapter 14, verse 17. Another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. And then another angel, the one who has a power over fire, came out from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle. Notice 2 angels, one calling to the other, just like we saw before. Again, further evidence that this is all angels, right? He calls and he says to him, put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth because her grapes are ripe. And so the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came out from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. All right, so there's imagery here in both cases. A reaping of a harvest, which is classic biblical symbology for believers, and a reaping of vines for a winepress, which is classic symbology for wrath being poured out on unbelievers. So you have 2 gatherings of a sort, one first, then the other. They're both described here at mid-trib, but you need to understand that they're both a bit looking ahead. Like this is a summary in both cases of what's going to happen in the second half of tribulation. And they come in an order. First, you're going to see the death of the believer in time passing over 3.5 years. But that's the first phase. During those 3.5 years, life for the unbeliever is pretty good. Their boss is in charge and he's having his way. Believers are the ones who have the trouble. But as it comes to the end of the 3.5 years, the roles reverse. And at the very end, you're seeing described here in symbolic terms, in poetic terms, if you will, you're hearing what God is going to eventually do at the very end. They're not happening at the same time. So this is a description of the death. Hear me on this. This last piece, verse 20. This is a summary description of what we will study more of in the future chapters, but it summarizes the death of the world's entire population of unbelievers in a moment at the end of tribulation. And obviously, believers have been dying all along, and maybe a few unbelievers die for other reasons, but there's a mass wiping out, a winepress of God's wrath against all who remain at the very end. And it will be a bloodbath, literally, producing a river of blood rising incredibly high, traveling impossibly far. 4.5 feet high, 200 miles long. Now, You might ask, how is that possible? Well, first, you're going to find out later, all of this happens in a narrow ravine that runs in Israel called the Kidron Valley. And the blood will run through the Kidron Valley, but we'll get back to that. But even if you did that, even if you did the math, you assume the flow is at the width of the valley and you put it at 4.5 feet high and you let it run for 200 miles. That is 62 billion cubic feet of blood. I did the math. It would require over 300 billion people to produce that much blood. There's only 8 billion on earth right now. So that means that you're not looking at a literal 200-mile-long river 4.5 feet wide or 4.5 feet tall. But the numbers being so specific, it must be a literal something. It just can't be that much because it's impossible. But what could it be? Well, if you assume 4.5 feet high, a swell of blood that's the width of the Kidron Valley, which is not a small thing. It's almost half a mile wide in some places. But 4.5 feet high, and imagine it more like a tsunami wave. That if the winepress of God crushes the world's population of unbelievers in an instant and releases the blood in that instant, and it just moves like a flood down the river. It flows for 200 miles. It's not 200 miles long. It moves that far because it's got so much force and so much size and momentum. But it's 4.5 feet high of a swell of blood through a valley. It still would be unbelievable, obviously. So let that scene settle in your mind and balance any concerns you might have had for what the believers experienced during the 3.5 years. To quote Paul, vengeance is mine, declares the Lord. Right? He'll take care of it in the end. All right. So as we end chapter 14, you're seeing described there at the very end the eventual fate of the unbelievers upon the return of Christ. But we got to get from mid-trib to that moment. So the specific moment happens at the end of tribulation. So this is a bit of a foreshadowing of the bowl judgments which culminate in Christ's second coming and immense bloodshed. In the meantime, this is what you have to imagine for the next 3.5 years. This is a relatively peaceful time on earth for the unbeliever. Only at the very end of tribulation does the turmoil kick up again. So let's do a quick review as we finish. We're going to do this to kind of get us out of mid-trib, because after tonight we're in the last half of tribulation and really at the very end. Because if you're kind of expecting 3.5 more years of activity, I hate to break it to you, but we're going to end up jumping, as the book does, from the mid-trib events to the very last piece of the 3.5 of the 7 years. Because what happens in between, you just learned. Believers dying, unbelievers okay. That's 3.5 years summary right there. And then you end up at the very end where things kick up again, and that's where the book goes. But in the meantime, what do we learn? Well, obviously we just learned another chapter on our stack here, which is that there are martyrdom of the 144,000, angels preaching, and then from that point forward you have evangelism ending and things just settle in. All right, now, remember this from earlier tonight, right? So from that scene, we're going to now add the last of the 144,000 die. Whatever previous ones may have died, they all finish dying before we get out of mid-trib and have entered heaven. And then the last 3.5 years look like this. All right, so you have martyrdom for believers, relative peace for unbelievers, and then we get to the very end. And you remember this from last few months ago, probably. The 7 seal judgments end with the 7th, and the 7th of the seal judgments was what? It is all of the trumpet judgments. Breaking the 7th seal is all of the trumpet judgments starting. And then the same pattern. The 7th trumpet judgment is all of the bowl judgments happening. Where we last left off before we got into mid-trib was God had done the 6 seal judgments, then the 7th one opened, and that led to the 6 trumpet judgments. And then we were told, as we got into that transition chapter, before chapter 10, we were told that there was one angel left waiting to blow his final trumpet, which is then going to lead us into the 7 bowl judgments. That's the last thing we heard. Then we got into all the mid-trib. Then we're going to come back next week, and we're going to see that 7th angel again, still cooling his heels with that trumpet, saying, when do I get to blow the trumpet? And then the trumpet is blown. And then we move into the final stages of the 7 years, which is the War of Armageddon. So we will study the War of Armageddon over the next several weeks, because it is a multi-stage war, and we'll go through every stage of it as it plays out. And the bowl judgments are pushing that war along.
Go ahead, Shiloh. You got to talk loud. This is Shiloh, my 6-year-old, saying hello. And we just finished 48, so we will carry on to 49.
Before you do,
Okay. Go ahead. Oh, you want to talk about your Minecraft world, huh? Okay.
the nether planet kind of blown by itself.
All right, friends, we have sorted out, for the most part anyway, the midpoint of tribulation, this middle time that we've studied now for a few weeks. And it is now ready, we're now ready to transition out of the middle, that is out of the midpoint of the 7 years, into the final months and weeks of that period of time. And let's do a quick review of where the world stands at this point, as it were, if we were there. Satan has resurrected the Antichrist. He is indwelling the man's body. And by his power, the Antichrist is now ruling the world. He is celebrated as a Messiah or a Savior of the world for having apparently stopped all of the judgments, or so it seems. And in the course of this period of time, Satan has also raised up another man called a false prophet, and he now leads the world in worshiping the Antichrist as part of a new religion, a new world religion. And he put a supernatural image in the Jewish temple, which gives everyone a chance to focus their worship there when the Antichrist isn't in the room, which is most of the time. And the world, as they worship this new God, takes a mark reflecting or representing him. They have to have this mark if they're going to buy or sell, and if they don't, they're beheaded. And for the most part, the only ones who are resisting this world movement are those who either believe in Jesus or those who are Jewish and have remained devoted to Yahweh, and they aren't willing to bend their knee to another God. Among those groups, there is a subset of them, Jewish believers in Petra. The rest are being persecuted wherever they exist in the world, especially in Jerusalem. Many are martyred, and if they are, they enter heaven, which is a blessing because they rest from the trials and they're prepared to enter into the kingdom in a resurrected form. Meanwhile, the rest of the world, they're enjoying a kind of uneasy peace right now. For the better part of the second half of tribulation, things seem to be going their way. There isn't any terrible calamities, at least at first. The world is under the rule of an Antichrist who seems to have everything under his authority. And the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments have kind of come and gone for the most part. There's still one remaining. But now in the second half of the tribulation period, we're just in a lull. And the next act in this drama is the release of the bowl judgments, which themselves collectively are the seventh trumpet. So we're waiting for that last trumpet to blow, the 7 bowls to be poured out. So as we sit here at this point, having finished the mid-trib period, ready to move into the last half of tribulation, we've got the martyrdom of believers as a continuous truth through this time. And we have relative peace for unbelievers as they go through this second half waiting for the end. And the Bible does not speak about that period very much. I mean, there's really nothing to talk about. We've already got the big picture. There's no meaningful event otherwise in that period. The next big event, the biggest event really, is we're waiting for Christ's second coming. And he ends the age, he ends the 7 years, as we know from Daniel. And then right before that, and how far ahead of it is a little unclear, but weeks maybe, days, weeks, not very long, the bowl judgments begin. And as the bowl judgments happen, they bring the world to the end with Christ. And that's what we're about to go study. So in the book of Revelation, the storyline, the narrative, jumps effectively from mid-trib to that very last part of the second half. Because I said, there's nothing really going on between them. That is nothing we don't already know. So we're now moving to chapter 15. Chapter 15, like chapter 11 was at the other end of the mid-trib period, it's a transition. It moves us out of the mid-trib discussion and back into the flow of the judgments. And so we start there in chapter 15. Let's go up, guys. Sorry if you can hit play again, my fault. Let's go to chapter 15. We'll go to verse 1. And I'm going to have to back up here or forward back to where I was. And You can get to see that again because it was kind of cool. 15:1. It says, "Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous. 7 angels who had 7 plagues, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished." So John in heaven gets directed once more to witness something. It's called a sign, a symbol. And in fact, all of chapter 15 is a sign. The sign begins with 7 angels holding 7 bowls. John says that these are the last. What he means, of course, is these are the last judgments of tribulation. But more than that, these are the last of God's judgments as required under the Old Covenant. Do you remember under the teaching we did already that the period of tribulation itself, the whole 7 years of it, is a consequence of the terms of the Old Covenant that was established between the Lord and Israel. So that all that's happening in these 7 years are appointed for Israel in keeping with the terms of the Old Covenant. That's what Daniel was told. Remember when Daniel was told about this period of the age of the Gentiles and of the 70 periods of 7 years that would be designated for Israel's judgment. When he was told about all of that, he was told that this period had been decreed for your people, for Israel, and for your city, Jerusalem, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin. To finish the transgression, of course, refers to their transgressing the Old Covenant. So we're going to put an end to their transgression of the Old Covenant. We're going to make an end of their sin. They won't have sin anymore. We're going to make an atonement for the iniquity that they demonstrated. And it will usher in everlasting righteousness, seal up vision and prophecy, and then anoint a new temple, the most holy place. All of these are the outcomes of this period of time called the age of the Gentiles. Well, until the period is over, that is, until the 70th 7 has played out, these can't come to pass. These are the result of 77s, and we've gone through 69 of them. Now we're in the middle of the final one, the 70th of it. When it's all said and done, this will have been accomplished. So in that sense, this is the wrath of God being finished for the sake of Israel and for the sake of the covenant. So God is obligated to pour out wrath on Israel because of the terms of the covenant, and he has to complete that wrath through these 7 judgments. Now, these 7 judgments are not directed at the believer. And we've studied this already, but this is not a series of judgments. This is one of the reasons why we know that the removal of the church from the earth doesn't wait until some moment during the 7 years, because if that were to happen, it's directly contradictory to the whole purpose of the 7 years. The 7 years are not appointed to the church, they're appointed to Israel and to unbelieving Israel, which is why we've already seen the believing remnant be set aside in Bozrah for a period of time, so they're protected. This is, again, in keeping with the principle. These judgments are not for the believer. They're for the unbeliever. So unbelieving Jews and the rest of the world are experiencing this, but the good effect of it, the purpose of it, is ultimately for Israel. So Zechariah gives us a good example of that. I'm reviewing this because of what we're going to see as we get into the text, but in Zechariah 13:7, Israel is told, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd and against the man, my associate, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd that the sheep may be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones. It will come about in all the land, declares the Lord, that 2 parts in it will be cut off and perish, but the third will be left in it. And I will bring the third part through the fire, refine them as silver is refined, and test them as gold is tested. And they will call on my name, and I will answer them, and I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is my God." All right, so this testing of Israel, the third that's left in the land, produces in them ultimately a salvation that brings them to God at the end. All right, so what we're watching here take place in the remainder of tribulation is the Lord narrowing his focus on the unbelieving Jew who still exists on the earth in that time, such that he can complete the purpose he set forth in these things, which is to bring Israel back to himself. And he delivers the judgment in that way after having delayed it for a very long time. Isaiah says this in Isaiah 48:8, "You have not heard, you have not known, even from the long ago, your ear has not been open, because I knew that you would deal very treacherously, and you have been called a rebel from birth. For the sake of my name, I delay my wrath, and for my praise I restrain it for you, in order not to cut you off. Behold," let me advance, there we go. He says, Behold, I refine you not as silver. I have tested you in the furnace of affliction for my own sake. For my own sake I will act. For how can my name be profaned, and my glory I will not give to another? Listen to me, O Jacob, even Israel, whom I've called. I am he, I am the first, I am also the last. So that's an indication from Old Testament, from Isaiah, of how the Lord has been saying to Israel from long ago, I have this purpose to refine you, to bring you back, to test you in a furnace of affliction. That's a reference to tribulation, and he's now fulfilling that. All right, so let's get back to chapter 15. But what you need to understand is 15 is starting to talk about the need for God to put these things into action to accomplish the plan he set forth. Back to 15, verse 2. And John says, I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who have been victorious over the beast and his image and the number of his name, standing on the sea of the glass, holding harps of God. And they sang the song of Moses, the bondservant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are your works, O Lord God, the Almighty. Righteous and true are your ways, King of the nations. Who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. For all the nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. All right, this is still part of the sign, and it has multiple parts, and it starts with the sea of glass mixed with fire. Now, sea, glass, and fire typically don't mix, not well. So you have to imagine John is seeing something here that he's having trouble describing, and he doesn't have a very good point of reference, so he's just drawing on things he knows, and he tries to describe it as best he can. Clearly, though, he's seeing something otherworldly. So standing on this sea, as he calls it, are those who have been victorious, he says, over the beast, which obviously is a reference to the antichrist, but in this context, to have been in that location, that is in the heavenly throne room, and to be called victorious means they've been martyred. So death here is called a victory over the beast, over his image, over the number of his name. And how then is death a victory? Certainly not the way the world would think of it, right? They would think that if you've been killed, you've lost. It's a victory here, first because it removes the person from the influence of the beast and it brings them to a place of rest. That much is not hard to understand. But it also means that once a saint dies in this period of history, they pass from the dominion of the enemy. Remember, he's bound to earth now. He can't go back and forth anymore. So they have passed from the dominion of the enemy to the dominion of the Lord. And here's the key. Since they have left the world behind, they are no longer within the reach of the enemy. They have overcome him in that sense, and they've overcome the mark in the sense that they never gave in to the demands to worship him or to take the mark, and now that they're free from the earth, they'll never have to worry about doing that or about being made to do that. So they have the time, they've run out the clock so that now the game is over. They don't have to worry anymore. They've died without giving in to the enemy's demands, and in that sense, they've passed a test of sorts. And they've overcome the enemy. It says that they never loved their physical life more than they loved the Lord. And that is exactly the kind of eternal perspective that every believer is supposed to maintain, right? That, as Jesus said, the one who seeks to gain his life will lose it, the one who loses his life will gain it. Speaking about this trade-off. All right, next, in the sign, you see tribulation saints singing with harps the song of Moses and the song of the Lamb. Now, these are two different songs that are being sung in that place. The song of Moses first, then the song of the Lamb. Now, the song of the Lamb is given to us here because it doesn't exist anywhere else. We've never heard of it before. So here in verses 3 and 4, you see the song of the Lamb being given to us, but they don't give us the song of Moses here because it's given to us elsewhere in the Bible. Let's talk about the Lamb first because it's the one we have in front of us. We know this is a praise to Christ, and of course we know that because though his name is not mentioned, we know the Lamb is Jesus. And the singers here declare Jesus is the righteous King of the nations, that he will soon be the one worshipped by all nations. And the point is obvious, that we're at a time now where tribulation is coming rapidly to its end, and that means Jesus' second coming is soon to happen, and at that, the kingdom will soon appear. And so the singing of the Song of the Lamb is simply to emphasize we're just about ready for everything we've been waiting for all this time. And then secondly, the singers are singing a song of Moses. Now there are two possible songs that are being sung when we think of the Song of Moses. Let me take you to the first. The first is possibly from Deuteronomy 32. And let me just take a part of it. It's a long song. Let me just grab some pieces of it for you. So starting in 32 verse 5, they have acted corruptly toward him, They are not his children because of their defect, but are a perverse and crooked generation. Do you thus repay the Lord, O foolish and unwise people? Is not he your father who has bought you? He has made you and established you. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of all generations. Ask your father. He will inform you. Your elder. They will tell you. They sacrificed to demons who were not God, to gods whom they have not known, new gods who came lately, whom your fathers did not dread. You neglected the rock who begot you and forgot the God who gave you birth. Vengeance is mine, and retribution in due time their foot will slip. For the day of their calamity is near, and the impending things are hastening upon them. For the Lord will vindicate his people and will have compassion on his servants when he sees that their strength is gone and there is none remaining, bond or free. And he will say, where are their gods, the rock in which they sought refuge? If I sharpen my flashing sword and my hand takes hold on justice, I will render vengeance on my adversaries, and I will repay those who hate me. That's a pretty good sample of what's in that song from Deuteronomy 32. It's speaking here about the nation of Israel, obviously. It comes at a point when Moses is about to die, and the nation's about to enter the promised land without him. And as he's at that point, he warns the nation that the Lord will deal in vengeance with them for their sin, and that a future Israel will become faithless, and they'll worship other gods, and they'll overlook the rock who saved them. And so the Lord will bring calamities upon them. He will bring them to the point where they see their strength gone, where they're broken. And in bringing them to that low point, breaking their rebellious hearts, he ultimately puts them in a position where he can restore them. But that's the heart of this song in Deuteronomy 32 is that of God dealing with a rebellious people by putting them through the ringer. You know, there's some kids that you cannot get through to except through the strongest of discipline. They're just not going to take anything less than the hardest thing you can give them. And Israel was basically, millions of people of that type, stiff-necked. The phrase in Hebrew is a euphemism. It simply refers to not being willing to bow your head to God, stiff-necked. So that was the Israel of that time, and this song, if it's one of the ones being sung in heaven now, it's clearly prophetic because ultimately the fulfillment of it is found in the events of tribulation. There have been minor versions of this in times past, but the ultimate, final effort of God to break the yoke of Israel and to get them to obey is the tribulation events because it brings Israel out in a glorified, sinless form. Now, if you remember, the relationship between Israel and the Lord is based on covenants. The first of those with Abraham was without condition. But the second of those, the Mosaic covenant, which came alongside the first, that one has conditions. And Israel's disobedience to that covenant required, according to its terms, that God pour out judgment against that nation for those sins, according to the terms of the agreement. And though there have been periods of history in the past when the Lord has brought versions of judgment, like when they were sent into Babylon and so on, we learned already from our study of Daniel that the age of the Gentiles, starting with Nebuchadnezzar and finishing here with these 7 years, this is the period of time that ultimately accomplishes all of that judgment for Israel. So the first song of Moses is one that reminds Israel of why they're going through what they're going through. And then the second song of Moses is in Exodus 15. It's at the point where Moses has just led the people of Israel through the Red Sea, and the sea has just closed down on the Pharaoh's army so that they're wiped out. And here's Israel now standing in Midian, free of their enemy, and having seen this take place. And then Moses and the people break out in this song. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall be gratified against them. I will draw out my sword, my hand will destroy them. You blew with your wind, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you among the gods, O Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in praises, working wonders? You stretched out your right hand. The earth swallowed them. In your loving kindness you have led your people whom you have redeemed. In your strength you have guided them to your holy habitation. Terror and dread fall upon them. By the greatness of your arm, they are motionless as stone until your people pass over, O Lord, until the people pass over whom you have purchased. You will bring them and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. All right, now you see another picture in that, don't you? That, in other words, that discussion of the Red Sea experience could just as easily be a discussion of what they're going to experience in tribulation. That the parallels are intentional. In Egypt, or in the Exodus story, you had an Israel escaping a slavery by fleeing into the desert from a determined enemy. And ultimately, through a series of miraculous judgments, the Lord brings them to himself, dwelling in safety in the promised land. Well, you have exactly the same set of circumstances here. In effect, Israel escaping a slavery to sin, fleeing into the desert, Petra being the example there, a determined enemy, Satan and the Antichrist, miraculous judgments ultimately bringing Israel back into the bond of the covenant and into the kingdom, which is the ultimate fulfillment of the promised land. One is just a giant picture of the other.
Okay, so we just finished up 49. I'm going to carry on to 50. If anybody needs prayer or anything they want to discuss, just let me know.
So you have a heavenly choir, and they're singing the Song of Moses, which I would argue would probably include elements of both of these songs, because both are relevant. On the one hand, the Lord is fulfilling his promise to bring vengeance and judgment. On the other hand, he will rescue his people in the end. And the next few chapters of Revelation explain how he does that. So let's make sense of this scene by understanding how these songs are a sign. You have a heavenly scene. It's communicating something about what's going to happen at the end of tribulation, communicating it through these songs. The first of those songs is sung about Jesus, which would indicate it's a song being sung as a sign to the believers who are still on earth during this time. And that song is communicating to the believer that Christ's return is imminent, that his time of rule is near, that he alone is righteous, he alone is holy, in contrast to the blasphemous claims of the enemy, and they just need to hold out a little longer. Their reward is almost there. And that sign from heaven, and the suggestion here would be that those on earth are going to see this or hear it. That's going to give the believer in tribulation something to cling to as they face the terrible persecution that will dominate in that second half of the 7 years. It's probably going to feel like, in that time, something like what it did when the Christians of Rome were being fed to lions, when the enemy will be tearing families apart, executing children in front of their parents, wives in front of their husbands, and probably carrying out even greater atrocities than we can imagine. And in that situation, a believer's confidence lies in the knowledge that they overcome through death and that the return of Christ is momentarily about to happen, and they don't have to hold out much longer. But the Song of Moses, in the second case, both the first kind of the first half and the second half of the Song of Moses, that's communicating to a completely different group of people. Moses' song, I believe, is being sung to the Jews of tribulation, particularly to the Orthodox, unbelieving Jews of that day. The first part of that song from Deuteronomy, reminding them that you're in the middle of all these circumstances because of your old covenant. And that's a very interesting sign when you think about it, that, in other words, they can take confidence and some kind of relief or comfort in the fact that their God is still on the throne working according to the terms of a covenant that they signed with him thousands and thousands of years ago. So they can get the point that our nation is atoning for something. Our nation is going through something he promised. And so ironically, the way the world has gone to hell in a handbasket is proof to them that God is still in control, because it's in a keeping with the covenant. And as such, his promises have not been broken. So it's another way of saying if he's going to keep all the bad promises, he's also going to keep all the good promises too. And for the same reason, I think the second Song of Moses is also speaking to these people as a sign. Even when things looked darkest for Israel, they had their backs up to the Red Sea, God found a way to save them. And in the middle of tribulation, when the Jews are at the end of their rope, they're going to remember God has said that Moses' song is relevant to this set of circumstances. And later in our study, you're going to see how the Lord does a miraculous rescue with their backs against the wall. All right, so the sign of chapter 15 is to two different persecuted groups in the second half of tribulation. That's what makes 15 a transition chapter. Believers are told to look forward to the Lord's coming and reigning. The Orthodox Jew is told to look forward to the Lord's rescue for his people, and they're meant to be encouragements to hold on. We're almost near the end. And then we get to verse 5. He says, "After these things I looked, and the temple of the tabernacle of testimony in heaven was opened." All right, now the next part of this sign transitions to the temple in heaven and to the opening of a tabernacle in heaven. Now, in the heavenly realm, right now, stands a tabernacle. It is, we assume, similar to the one that Moses was instructed to build for Israel in the law, because the writer of Hebrews tells us that the earthly tabernacle was patterned on the one that's in heaven. In Hebrews 9:23, it says, "It was necessary for the copies of the things in heaven to be cleansed with these, with blood of animals, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us." You see how the writer keeps calling the one on earth a copy? It's a copy of something in heaven. And elsewhere in the law itself, it's called a pattern. It's based on a pattern. The one on earth is based on a pattern. So, in the tabernacle we know that he gave Moses on earth, you had a multi-chambered building, and in the smallest room, the back, the holy place, the Holy of Holies, we call it, there was an ark. And the ark had a lid on it, which we call the mercy seat. And on the mercy seat is where the glory of God would appear. So we assume that there is a tabernacle in heaven with a mercy seat in heaven. And Ezekiel 28 tells us that Satan's original job was to guard the mercy seat in the heavenly tabernacle. He was one of the cherubs whose wings were over the mercy seat in heaven. And the Shekinah glory of God dwells on the one on earth, and we must assume it's also dwelling at the one in heaven. But at a point in Israel's history, specifically in 605 BC, right before Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the temple, the glory of the Lord left the temple. You can see that in Ezekiel as well. And it left because God was about to let Nebuchadnezzar destroy the building. And he wasn't going to be there, of course, when that happened. So the Shekinah glory of God exits the building, and where Ezekiel sees this and describes it to us. Shortly thereafter, Nebuchadnezzar wiped it out, and with that starts the age of the Gentiles. And for the entire period of the age of the Gentiles, God's glory has never returned to the temple because we are in the age of Gentiles. The next time that the glory of God will appear in a temple on earth is at the outset of the 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. Why? Because that will be a new age, not the age of Gentiles, but the age of a Jewish king. It'll be the age of Israel again. So with the return of Jesus and the establishment of the kingdom, God's glory will re-inhabit a building on earth once again. And for those who've been in the Ezekiel study with me, you'll remember that that's where Jesus lives for the entire 1,000 years, in the Holy of Holies, never to leave that place. And we'll study that a little more when we look at chapter 20. So, as the Lord now prepares to throw the final bits of wrath on the earth, the bowl judgments, and bring the 7 years to an end, right before that happens, he opens the tabernacle in heaven as a sign, whether it's visible from earth or not, I'm not sure, but John sees it. And the glory of the Lord on the mercy seat in the heavenly tabernacle becomes visible for a time. What do you think that says? What's the message to particularly Israel, who hasn't seen the glory of the Lord since 605 BC? It's a way of saying, my return to my household is about to happen. I'm coming back. Here's what Ezekiel says of the day yet to come for us even, when the glory of the Lord enters his house again. In Ezekiel 43, describing this scene, Ezekiel says, "And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house. Then I heard one speaking to me from the house, while a man was standing beside me. And he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne, and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell among the sons of Israel forever. And the house of Israel will not again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their harlotry and by the corpses of their kings when they die, by setting their threshold by my threshold and their doorpost by my doorpost, with only the wall between me and them. And they have defiled my holy name by their abominations which they have committed, so I have consumed them in my anger. Now let them put away their harlotry and the corpses of their kings far from me, and I will dwell among them forever." All right, so that's what we're leading toward. This scene in chapter 15 is a bit of a preview. And the next part of the sign communicates that the time for the Lord to finish with wrath and to return to dwelling with Israel has come. And so with that, now angels emerge with bowls of final judgment. It says, and 7 angels who had the 7 plagues came out of the temple, clothed in linen, clean and bright, and girded around their chests with golden sashes. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. All right, so now we're getting into the last judgment. You can see 15 is just teeing us up for where we're going. And the 7th trumpet judgment, which, as you remember, is now these 7 bowls, is about to be fulfilled. We heard the trumpet blown earlier in an earlier passage, but now we're waiting to see it all play out. Here it begins. And the bowls have been handed to the angels. Now, wrath, God's wrath, is commonly depicted in the Bible as something that can be poured out, obviously figuratively speaking. But you can find examples of this everywhere. Examples of a cup of pouring out being a description of wrath, or someone drinking a cup of wrath, so being drowned in it, so to speak. And that likewise, God's wrath can be stored up. You can fill up a cup with God's wrath, so to speak. And now you see wrath measured here, not in cups, but for the first time in Scripture, bowls. All right? Indicating you have a greater form of judgment here. Israel has stored up for herself not cups of wrath, but bowls of wrath. And it's going to be poured out in full measure. Paul says in Romans chapter 2, verse 5, because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to each person according to his deeds. Now, believer, this is what we've been saved from. All that wrath that you had stored up has been poured out on Christ, right? That's the gospel. But it is interesting to see that there is a quantum, a measuring of wrath. I don't believe this is entirely euphemistic. It's figuratively written, but I don't believe it's entirely euphemistic in its meaning. I believe there is more wrath for some than for others, which is the indication here. And then, back to 15, there's an interesting moment in chapter 15. It says, and the temple was filled with the smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no one was able to enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were finished. All right, so the temple in heaven is filled with the smoke that represents his glory and the power of the Lord, and then everyone, it says, is barred from entry into the temple. Now, ask yourself this, who normally enters the temple of God? And in the case of Israel, it was, under the law, it was the priests, right? They were the only ones who could enter. And in the case of the Holy of Holies, only the high priest could enter. So if we assume that the heavenly tabernacle is operating under similar principles, remember, the one on earth was patterned after it after all, then we must conclude that when it says no one may enter the temple, what it says is no priest will enter the temple. And what priests are in heaven? Well, there's only one that we know of, Christ, the high priest, right? So the indication is that the Father has barred Jesus from entering the temple until after the 7 bowl judgments. Now ask yourself this, if Jesus can't enter the temple, then he cannot go before the Father for intercession. And if he cannot make intercession, then there can be no grace, which is to say, this is a further indication that during this last part of the 7 years, it is not possible for new faith on the earth. It is not possible for salvation. There is no intercession available at this point. Back to what we said in weeks past, once you move past mid-trib, you have the mark, you're done. You don't have the mark, you're persecuted, but there's no new people joining one or the other group. Everyone picks a side at the beginning, and you're set for 3.5 years. So chapter 15 is a transition chapter. It leads us out of mid-trib. So technically, as we get out of chapter 15, we're still at about the mid-trib point. We're just leaving that scene. So the indication here is that as you enter into the second half of tribulation, the bowl judgments are poised, and Jesus is outside the temple for that period of time. And now as the bowl judgments start, which is near the end of that 3.5 years, the pace moves rapidly. We come through this in a fairly short period of time. Again, based on what we'll study, I would argue it's probably no more than a matter of a few weeks. All right. Now at the end of chapter 15, we officially have done the mid-trib part of this study. Now we start with chapter 16. And with chapter 16, we're going to continue to build our understanding of how we get to the end of the 7 years. There, just like with mid-trib, as you get to the end of tribulation, a lot is happening. The sequence is tough to follow because the chapters keep talking about similar things that are all happening at the same time. So we have to understand the cause and effect. We have to build a sequence. You're going to get lots of charts. It's all going to be laid out. So in some ways, the end of this 7-year period is similarly complex to the middle, because as the bowl judgments are poured out, a bunch of stuff happens. All right? Let's start with the first 5 of the bowl judgments. Chapter 16, verse 1. Then I heard a loud voice from the temple saying to the 7 angels, "Go and pour out on the earth the 7 bowls of the wrath of God." So the first angel went and poured out his bowl on the earth, and it became a loathsome and malignant sore on the people who had the mark of the beast and who worshipped his image. The second angel poured out his bowl into the sea, and it became blood like that of a dead man, and everything in the sea died. Then the third angel poured out his bowl into the rivers and the springs of waters, and they became blood. And I heard an angel of the waters saying, "Righteous are you who are and who were, O Holy One, because you judge these things. For they poured out the blood of saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. They deserve it." Then I heard the altar saying, "Yes, O Lord God, the Almighty, true and righteous are your judgments." The fourth angel poured out his bowl upon the sun, and it was given to it to scorch men with fire. Men were scorched with fierce heat, and they blasphemed the name of God who has the power over these plagues, and they did not repent so as to give him glory. Then the fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom became darkened, and they gnawed their tongues because of pain. And they blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and they did not repent of their deeds. All right, so the final wrath of God is poured out, and with it, we get a new level of suffering and misery. Now, before we look at each of them, just note here how often we see this repeating pattern, that the judgments are limited to those who are not of the Lord. It's the ones who have the mark that get the sores. It's the ones who are of the enemy's kingdom who are in the darkness. An exact parallel to what you see in the Egyptian plagues, in which the nation of Israel, set aside in Goshen, was accepted, not included in those judgments. The Lord, as James tells us, knows how to distinguish or differentiate between those who are under judgment and those who are not. He is not indiscriminate. And as a result, it's more proof to add to what we've already studied that you do not have to think that someone's going to enter into the tribulation, much less any of us, because the whole thing is meant to be some kind of last series of disciplinary moves on God's part. That's not what this is about. This is wrath poured out. It's wrath poured out against people who don't know him for a good purpose in the end, but we're not there. All right, so let's go through each of these. First, you have a bowl that results in a physical outcome of loathsome sores. Loathsome sores. The word loathsome is from a Greek word that means wretched and malignant. It's literally the word for evil or wicked. So if these sores are vile and wicked, that must mean that they disrupt the flesh in some kind of unimaginable way. You might even imagine the way Jesus' own body was ripped to shreds by the scourging. This might be doing something similar to the bodies of humanity. And then we have the second bowl. God puts an end to all sea life by making all seas turn to blood. Now, besides an uncountable number of dead and rotting fish, and we're talking about seas after all, the blood itself would begin to congeal and putrefy, and that's going to shut down the water cycle of the planet, if it's even still been going on at all, right? Stopping all rain. And you have this unimaginable environmental disaster, but you also have the impossibility of sea navigation now. So that's now, that comes back later. Then you have a third bowl now, making freshwater sources also turn to blood. Obviously, the angel explains these are as a repayment for what's been done to the saints, pouring out the blood of saints. And I love that phrase, they deserve it. Now, this judgment is one of the indications we have that I would point to as support for saying that the bowl judgments happen at the very end of the 7 years. As some might imagine these, they would tell you that they're kind of sprinkled across the 3.5 years, but I think that really is inaccurate for a number of reasons, but here's one of them. How long can someone survive without water to drink? I mean, a few days, right? Now, maybe the world's stockpiled a little bit of water in some places and they can survive for a time. But look, they were not talking about 3.5 years. You can't go 3.5 years on the planet with no fresh or salt water, right? So this is at a point where things rapidly move to an end.
Okay, So that was session 50. My mouse is not wanting to cooperate here. I'm going to go on to 51. How's everybody doing today?
And then fourth, you have the sun increasing in intensity to the point that it burns men. Now imagine living with this. Imagine living with evil, wretched sores in a world with no rain and no fresh sources of water whatsoever. And now on top of that, the earth is scorching you with tongues of fire, and people are being scorched by the heat of the sun. And that heat, by the way, would also rapidly increase the decomposition of the blood and all the dead animals that are now around. I mean, the air and the earth must be wretched at this point, right? So you have that taking place. And then fifth, you have the fifth bowl judgment is darkness. And that darkness is so intense that it causes unbearable pain. Now, how does darkness create pain? Well, the answer is it's not merely the lack of physical light here. This is a spiritual darkness. In other words, it's similar to the way the Father withdrew his presence from Jesus while Jesus hung on the cross. And in the way that the Father and the Son became separated, which is the second death, in that Jesus died the second death before he died the first death. He died his second death on the cross, and then he died the first death of the body after that, which, by the way, is exactly what Adam did. He was the second Adam. Adam died spiritually first, and then he died physically later. Christ died spiritually first in the sense that he was separated from the Father. That's what spiritual death means. It doesn't mean cessation of existence. It means separation from the Father. So when Jesus says, "My Lord and my Lord, why have you forsaken me?" Sorry, I can't talk all of a sudden. "My Father, why have you forsaken me?" He was saying, where did you go? First time in all of eternity that Jesus and the Father weren't one. And that was the second death on the cross. Then when the second death had been completed and light returned, he says it is finished. So the work of redemption was finished at his death on the cross. The darkness, though, that came upon the earth for the 3 hours that he was separated was a darkness of God having withdrawn his presence from creation. That's the whole idea of being withdrawn. And in this case, as the Creator separates himself from the creation for this period of darkness, it means that what is there is left to the mercy of the spiritual forces of darkness. So for a time, the world feels the effect of the Lord's wrath by an absence of his protection, of the absence of his common grace. Now look, there's a pattern that you follow in these five that start to tell you what he's attempting to do here. You have scorching heat. See if this doesn't ring any bells. Scorching heat, darkness, no water, no refreshment, at the mercy of the enemy, and no physical relief from torment. You're experiencing a preview of hell. And it's because it's under the same conditions as hell. What is hell? Hell is a place that experiences continually the outpouring of God's wrath. What is this? This is an outpouring of God's wrath, producing the same effect on earth for a time. And it makes sense then that the outpouring of God's wrath would be felt in similar ways. Heat, darkness, the lack of his counsel or presence, etc. And what is the world's response to all of these calamities? Well, in verse 9, they continue to blaspheme. And the reason they continue to blaspheme and they will not repent is that they cannot do so. No one can do so apart from the grace of God. There is no actor, no catalyst moving their hearts to God. All they can do is be who they are. And what does an evil, desperately wicked heart do? This. And no amount of tragedy, no amount of pressure, pain, or otherwise is going to convert someone. What is it that brings us to repentance? The kindness of the Lord, not the severity of our punishment. So an unbeliever's sin nature, it's eternal. And so the rebellious behavior of an unbeliever is also eternal. And for the same reason, an unbeliever's punishment must be eternal. Nothing's changing it. It just keeps going, so the conditions keep going. And these judgments are reinforcing the sign of what we saw at the beginning of chapter 15 in the Song of Moses. That is, in the Exodus, the nation of Israel was held captive by Egypt, and the Lord used judgments to free his people. Here again, you have Israel being captive to an enemy, both in the sense literally of the antichrist, but also in the sense of their own sin. And the Lord is pouring out judgment as a precursor to freeing his people. And if you look at the bowls themselves, 1, 2, 3, and 5, all have direct parallels to judgments that take place during the Exodus. So there's an intentional connection here to remind us that these judgments have as their ultimate purpose a freeing of Israel, not the destruction of Israel. And yet, there is a ton of collateral damage in the process. And chief among them is Israel's enemy being laid waste, which is what you see here. All right, so now we've studied the first 5 bowls. Let's pause to look at how those bowls fit into the overall plan for the end of tribulation, because you're sitting here thinking, well, we got a lot of book left, and we just did 5 of the last 7 judgments. What's going on here? Well, because the first 5 are really just setting the backdrop, setting the stage for what's now going to start to happen. These first 5 are a systematic delivery of hell to earth in preparation for the Lord's return. And as such, they're called the plagues. Actually, in the text we read, all 7 are called plagues. So all 7 are technically plagues. But I'm going to make a bit of a audible here. I'm going to make my own call on this. That is, I'm not contradicting the Scripture, obviously, but I'm saying in the way I'm going to teach it, I'm going to call the first 5 plagues because they stand apart from the last 2 in a very distinct way, keeping in mind that the Scripture says they're all plagues. But the first 5 I'm calling plagues in a different sense. They are these disasters that bring hell to earth. And they're an outpouring of God's wrath. They are also a preparation, though, for what's going to happen in the next 2 chapters. In chapters, actually the next 3, 17, 18, and 19. The last 2 judgments, when you look at what they actually accomplish, may seem very insignificant compared to the ones we just looked at. But they are part of a larger set of events. And they climax in something called the War of Armageddon. That war has multiple stages, and the war ends at the end of tribulation and at the moment of Christ's second coming. So the first 2 stages of the war, of this 5-stage war, are set in motion by the final 2 bowl judgments. So what we're looking at now as we move out of the 5 and into the last 2 is a series of complex movements on earth as part of a larger war, where God himself is establishing or moving this war along by these judgments that present the need for them. In fact, the first 5 are the reason the war starts. And then the 6th and the 7th are God's way of directing the war in a certain way. Okay? Let's talk about the war for a second. Even just the use of the word Armageddon will trigger usually a wide variety of misconceptions and assumptions about what that is. Some think it's already happened, some think it's going to happen in our day, some people don't even understand it at all. Most have heard of it, but like most war, the events of this war are complex and they defy a simple explanation. You could write a whole book on it, and some have. Let's begin with the fact that the War of Armageddon is not a single military engagement. It's not a single moment. It's a series of campaigns over a series of days or weeks. It takes place in a series of locations. It involves many different groups and characters. And as usual, Revelation is going to give us a broad outline on these things, but you have to go to the Old Testament to get the detail. That's part of what we'll be doing in the coming weeks. But even more confusing than that, the descriptions of the war and the events of this war are sprinkled throughout chapters 16 through 19. And here's how they relate. The War of Armageddon generally is described by the 6th and 7th bowl judgments and the activity of chapter 19, which leads us into Christ's second coming, plus Old Testament texts that give us the detail. But chapter 16 is talking about events that set up the whole of the war. Chapter 17 is talking only about the events of that last judgment. Chapter 18 goes back to talk about things that were going on when the earlier judgments were happening. And chapter 19 is talking about the very last stages of the war. So knowing that is important to putting the whole battle plan together. Now we're going to have maps. We're going to have little tanks moving around on maps. We're going to have all kinds of stuff. You're going to figure it out with me. It's not that hard, but once you see it. But we have to do this in stages. That's why we have a lot left to do, even though we're at the end of the, quote, judgments. All right? We're going to dissect all this in the coming weeks. First, let's establish for tonight the relationship between the bowls and the opening events of the war. And we're going to begin where we left off in Revelation 16 at the 6th judgment. Okay? Verse 12. The 6th angel poured out his bowl on the great river, the Euphrates, and its water was dried up. so that the way would be prepared for the kings from the east. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits, like frogs. For they are spirits of demons, performing signs which go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them together for the war of the great day of God the Almighty. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, so that he will not walk about naked, and men will not see his shame. And they gathered them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Har Megiddo. All right, so as the 6th angel pours out his bowl, we're told that the effect of this bowl is, drum roll, a river dries up. Well, the river here is the Euphrates. It's the major river of Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq. It runs near the ancient city of Babylon. Now, we know from the earlier bowl judgments that all the rivers of the earth have been turned to blood, right? So this one must also have been turned to blood, okay? And the fact that it says that the water was dried up, don't let that make you think we're dealing with a contradiction, or there's some confusion here. Blood is mostly water, all right? Mostly water. So the point of this is not to get technical or scientific. The point of this is to say what was once an impassable river of blood is now dry as a result of this. And as a result now, that river is no longer filled with water or with anything, okay? It's not like what I show you there. So how is that a judgment? Why is that considered a bold judgment? Well, in verse 12, we're told why. It's to make possible a way for the kings of the east. Now, any reference to a king at this point, at this time in history, has to be a reference to one of those 7 guys who originally had power before he came along, the Antichrist, when there was 10 of them. Now there's only 7. Now they've all fallen in line underneath him. Those are the only kings we know of that would exist in that day. So it appears as though when it says that these kings are now called from the east, we're talking about the leaders that have worked with the Antichrist to establish this new government and are under his authority. Why are they all in the east? Well, the indication is they're all in the capital city. They're all in the place that the Antichrist has decided to call his home. We know from Daniel that these kings would rule with this man all the way to the end. And so when verse 12 says that this judgment prepares a way for these kings, the suggestion is that it's a way of letting them travel. Well, that would mean that this this river rather, of blood had been an impediment to them for travel. And so now the Lord is drying up the river so that they can travel to go where the Lord apparently wants them to go. The question is, why does he want them to travel? And how does opening the opportunity for travel constitute a judgment of any significance? Well, in verses 13 through 16, we get to see how this movement plays a part in the judgment. It says the dragon and the beast and the false prophet, once they see the river dried up, they see an opportunity. And they enact a plan. They send out unclean spirits as messengers to these kings. Now, an unclean spirit is a demon. It makes sense that Satan would be using demons, right, as messengers. John says they're like frogs. I think that's because in the Old Testament, a frog was a symbol of an unclean spirit. A frog is an unclean animal, but it's often used as a symbol of a demon. So the demons call the 7 kings of the earth. They gather their military forces, and they're sent to a place that in Hebrew is Har Megiddo. The word Har in Hebrew is the name for hill, and Megiddo is the name of a city in northern Israel. It's a ruin today. You can go visit it in the Jezreel Valley. This is the Jezreel Valley. This is a picture taken from the top of Mount Carmel, which is looking roughly east, northeast. Actually, that's southeast. And if you were to, you can't see it very well, but right here in the distance is Megiddo. And so Megiddo is one of a series of hills that surround the valley of Jezreel. It's a very wide, open, flat area in northern Israel. And that valley is where they're all going. They're not going to the little hill that's next to the valley. They're just going to the valley, but the hill is sort of the reference point. Megiddo is the little town. Historically, had been a place that Solomon set up to guard the pass into the Jezreel Valley, so it's a fortified location. But they're all going into that valley. We'll learn a lot more about this later. So Har Megiddo is the hill of Megiddo, or Tel Megiddo. And when you transliterate that from Hebrew into English, people start saying Armageddon, Armageddon. So the word Armageddon comes from Har Megiddo. This is the location that the kings will move to in response to the call of the demons once that judgment has dried up the river. So what we're saying is this, that out in the east, there is a location in which these men have headquartered and had their forces. It has to be east of the river, otherwise the river wouldn't have been an impediment to get to the Jezreel Valley. So Babylon being on the east side of that river, we learn later in future chapters that it is in fact at Babylon that they are headquartered. And as these 5 first judgments come to the earth, the ones we've already studied, life now has become unlivable. And not just unlivable, think of it in human terms this way. Just as when Satan was cast down from heaven, he knew his time was short. Once the earth has no more water, time is short. At that point, you got nothing to lose. You're about to die. The whole world is about to die. And in the midst of that, Satan and the world with him realizes they've got to do something desperate. God has put them in a position for them to act out of desperation. And what Satan does through the Antichrist and the false prophet is send messages to the kings and their forces, essentially all that's left of their army and who they are on earth. And I would assume the message includes something of a, hey guys, look at our situation. We don't have much time left. We need to do something here. And I would assume what Satan proposes is that if the forces of the Antichrist marshal themselves en masse in Israel and attack in Jerusalem, they can be prepared to destroy the Christ, to destroy Jesus at his second coming. So they're preparing for the battle, as we heard here, of the great war of the God Almighty. They have decided they're going to take the war to God as opposed to waiting for him to come back. And they look at the state of the world and they conclude, we don't have a lot of time. And that was God's intent. So he puts them in under time pressure. They begin to respond as he expects, and they begin to move to where they know his return will happen, at the Mount of Olives, according to Scripture, and at the return of Christ to Jerusalem. Moreover, there's another aspect to this. The enemy is going to target the remaining Jews that are holding out in the city of Jerusalem, hoping that if he could destroy all of them, then Christ's reason to come back wouldn't exist. We'll talk more about that later. So here's how they move. They come from Babylon. I assume they follow the Fertile Crescent. Traditionally, that's what people do. You don't drive across the desert. And they end up in this northern area of Jerusalem, in the Jezreel Valley. Ironically, we talk about the war of Armageddon, but there's actually no fighting in that area. That's just an area of massing of forces before they move down to Jerusalem, where the actual battle happens. This is just a wide enough valley that you can put a bunch of people and a bunch of armament. And so the first stage of the war, stage 1, which is created out of the first 6 bowl judgments. The first 5 give urgency and incentive, and then the 6th gives opportunity by drying up the river. That stage 1 involves the movement of the Antichrist forces out of his capital city toward Israel, massing them in an attempt to hold off or destroy the return of Christ. But what they've actually done is they've put themselves all in one place so that Jesus can destroy them all at one time. Now, as I said, we haven't heard the name of his capital yet in the text, but we'll hear it soon enough. It's on the chapters to come. It is Babylon. And Babylon itself becomes a major topic as we move into the rest of this study. That, in other words, in verse 15, if you notice there at the end, the Lord inserts that parenthetical statement to the believer who lives during these difficult times. It's similar to the statement he makes in Revelation 3 to Laodicea when he warns that church. He says, I'm coming like a thief. He says to them, though, you need to be ready for my return for the church, which we know is the rapture. Here, Jesus is talking to those who are on the earth, but it's from the same general perspective. That is, here he's saying, you better be ready for my second coming, because it's about to happen. When you see these events happening, it's about to happen. This is your last chance. So just as the unbeliever in the church today will not recognize who the Lord is, and she will not be taken by the rapture. Similarly, the unbeliever in that day will not recognize that the second coming of Christ is right about to happen, and they will not be ready for that moment either. All right, that's the end of our study tonight. When we come back one more week before the break, we'll move into the next stages of this battle, moving into chapter 19 ultimately. But chapters 17 and 18 are two chapters talking about the destruction of something called Babylon. And it's an in-depth discussion that involves a lot of detail, a lot of things from the Old Testament, which we'll get into.
Okay, and that was session 51. And to be caught up to where the regular Tuesday night prophecy study is at, I'll be going to 59 today, and then we'll be all caught up. Let's see, that was 51, right? Terrible with my memory. Here we go. If anybody needs prayer, don't hesitate to let me know, and I'm going to get this going.
All right, we are now at the climactic period of the 7-year tribulation. You guys have been waiting with me for this for now, 7, 8 months or something? And the time of Jacob's troubles is coming to a head. You have God pouring out his wrath in the form of these bold judgments. So we have the first that we've studied so far, the 6 that we've studied so far, have all come upon the earth. The first of those, the first 5, are called the plagues, and they produce devastating destruction on the earth in such a way that life isn't even possible anymore. I mean, there's no fresh water on the earth anymore, so it's only a matter of a very brief time before everyone on the earth knows they're going to perish one way or another. It's a very dramatic way to put the world on notice that the end is here. And then the final 2 judgments will kick off a complex series of events that are collectively known as the War of Armageddon. And in chapter 16, last week, we got an overview of those 7 judgments and of the first stages of the war. We studied the first phase, which was the 6th judgment. And then today we'll look at the 7th and the beginning of that. Then we'll have several more stages that come in conjunction with Christ's return. And in the way that maps out on the chapters that we've been studying, or will study, it's a bit of a mixture. You have some things covered in multiple chapters, other things covered only in one chapter. So that complexity makes it a little tricky when you're trying to understand it as you read through it. Well, we're going to figure that out. Now, last week, as we looked at the first of those Armageddon judgments, which is the 6th bowl judgment, it started phase 1 of the battle. And if you remember, phase 1 was you had the river Euphrates, which had previously been turned to blood by some of the earlier judgments of the bowl judgments. Well, the 6th bowl judgment dries it up and leaves it in a way that now the Antichrist forces, which are headquartered in Babylon on the east side of that river, can now travel across that river. And because they travel across it, the Lord opens a way for them to reach Jerusalem. And then he motivates Satan to launch this attack by eliminating all sources of fresh water in the world. So in other words, the earlier judgment that made the world uninhabitable has put pressure on Satan to consider that his end is very near and he has to do something. God then opens the doorway for the river to dry up, and in doing that, he makes a way for Satan to act on his desire to do something. And knowing that Christ's return is imminent, knowing that he comes back at Jerusalem, he moves his forces to the northern end of Israel, to a place called the Jezreel Valley. And the Jezreel Valley is a broad plain in which you can mass a large number of troops. And that's what he does. He brings his troops into this area. That's stage 1 of the battle. It's a preparatory step. It's basically a bivouac, moving forces into a position where they can then attack. And the stage is now set for the end of the war, the end of the world through a coming war. Now the Lord is going to direct the enemy's actions like pieces on a chessboard from here on out. Even in this one we just studied, he has moved Satan to somewhere he wants Satan to be, because we're about to reach a point of a battle between good and evil, and the Lord is preparing the pieces on the chessboard, so to speak. And now that brings us to the final bowl judgment and the cascade of activity that will follow from it. And let's start with reading on that. This is a judgment focused on the fall of a great city, and this fall is probably the most important event in all of tribulation. In fact, it is so important that this one judgment requires 2.5 chapters of Revelation. And it's the next stage of the War of Armageddon. Let's start reading in verse 17, where we left off last week in chapter 16. And he says, "Then the seventh angel poured out his bowl upon the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne, saying, 'It is done.' And there were flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder, and there was a great earthquake, such as there has not been since man came to be upon the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found, and huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men. And men blasphemed God because of the plagues of the hail, because its plague was extremely severe." All right, so the final bowl judgment's poured out. You notice it says it's poured out into the air. It's almost as if the wrath of God coats the entire planet like a blanket. I kind of imagine something like this. And if you think about it, the atmosphere of our earth is like a big ocean of air around our earth, right? You guys don't want to see that over and over again, do you? So just as the previous bowl judgments were poured into bodies of water, whether salt or fresh, so you have here a judgment that is effectively poured into an ocean of air. And it's like a dye being poured into a pool. It just mixes thoroughly so that every part of the pool is touched. So this is symbolic of God's wrath going everywhere on earth. Now, in literal terms, it's an earthquake, starts with an earthquake, but it's not unlike we've ever seen, he says. And it produces a devastation that's probably on a par with Noah's flood, just without the water. So you have mountains gone, islands gone. Even the continents appear to be ripped apart. Now remember, mountains and islands, geographically speaking, are the same thing. They're peaks of mountain, peaks above water or peaks on the ground, same thing. So it seems as though he's saying that any high place on the earth is sinking into the crust of the earth. Anything built on a mountain, therefore, would be gone. Anything on an island is gone. The only cities that would remain at this point are those that are built on plains, that is, off of the mountains. But even those are leveled, it says. And as this judgment happens, you hear this statement, the final judgment has come, it is done. And the Greek word for done can also mean accomplished. So what it's saying is this: the wrath of God and his purposes in the tribulation have come to an end, have been met by the final outpouring of wrath through this last bowl. Revelation 15, verse 1, I'll skip past my little demonstration again. It said this. When we were in chapter 15, we read this. "Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels who had 7 plagues, and he says, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished." So it is done reflects that. As promised, these judgments bring an end to God's wrath. You remember also when Jesus was on the cross, he said something very similar. Do you remember that? He said, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished," and he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So on the cross, Christ was taking the wrath of God upon himself for our sake. And once he had received God's wrath poured out for sin unto him, then he declared the wrath of God against the elect is finished. So the wrath of God is poured out one way or another. It's either poured out upon those who will bear God's wrath themselves, or it is poured out upon Jesus, who took our place in receiving that wrath, which is why John says, "He who believes in the Son has eternal life, but he who does not obey the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him." So you could think of it this way: in heaven, there's a quantity of wrath that everyone deserves. And it's poured out in one of 2 places, on Jesus or on you. And that's effectively the message of the gospel. Let him take it for you. Moving on, it says there was a hailstorm to end all hailstorms, bringing 100-pound hail falling on the earth. Now, when you think of hail, you think of ice, but In biblical terms, hailstorms are not ice. A hailstone in the Bible is a stone, a rock. So we're talking here about 100-pound rocks falling. Now, 100 pounds of a rock is probably not that big. I mean, you get 100 pounds pretty quickly when you have a stone. But moving from the sky to the ground, that thing's a missile, leaving nothing intact. That would mean complete devastation upon the earth. Everything is gone. I mean, this is basically the end of the world. So you would think at this point with an earthquake like that and with hailstones like that, you would think people on earth would realize this is from God, and they do, but at the same time, they just blaspheme him for it. You know, it's kind of like the guy who was the thief on the cross. He's about to die, and here he is blaspheming Jesus. You'd think, like the other thief told him, why don't you have any fear of God knowing where you are right now? You're moments from seeing God. Why aren't you fearing him more? Same thing here. All right, so let's ask the fundamental question. What's the purpose in all these disasters? Well, verse 19, we're told, all the cities of the nations fall. But the Greek word for nations, ethnos in Greek, it's the word for Gentiles. It's a term for Gentile nations because from a Hebrew point of view, and the Hebrews wrote the Bible, from a Hebrew point of view, there's Israel and there's the nations. So in biblical terms, the term nation means everyone but Israel. So when it says all the cities of the nations fell, it means all Gentile cities fell. And therefore, the purpose of the seventh bowl judgment is to eliminate all Gentile cities everywhere on earth. Nothing is left. Between an earthquake and 100-pound stones, there's nothing. Only Jerusalem exists at this point intact, excluded from these judgments. And since Jerusalem stands on a mountain, we must assume that one mountain has not been destroyed either, for if it had been, Jerusalem as well would have been. And we'll know later as we get further into this study that I'm right, because Jerusalem will later show up in the text. So it's alone, it's still intact, it's still there. That's where Jesus is coming back. And because it's on a mountain, and there are no other mountains, it is now the highest city on the earth. The highest mountain on the earth, the only mountain on the earth. But there is still one other Gentile city remaining, at least to some degree. In verse 19, we're told that a great city was split into three parts. And now at first glance, you might think, well, gee, a great city, that must mean Jerusalem, right? Well, when we reference our rules for interpretation, that is, you have something that's not defined, you go look for its definition elsewhere, this is what you find. The great city, the term great city, appears in only 8 verses in all the Bible, all of them in Revelation, and in every instance it refers to the same place, Babylon. For example, if we jump forward to chapter 18, you find one of those occurrences. In chapter 18 it says, then a strong angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, so will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will not be found any longer. All right, one of the 8 references. Now, if you are a particularly observant Bible student, you might be looking at this right now saying, I remember one earlier, Steve, that seemed to be talking about a different city. And I'm sure you were all thinking this, so I'll just take you right back there now. Revelation 11:8, when it was speaking about the 2 witnesses dying, it said, their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is mystically called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. And so at this point, we know verse 8 there is talking about Jerusalem because that's the place Jesus was crucified. That is a unambiguous reference. There's no other choice for that city. And so in that context, we know that verse 8 is talking about Jerusalem. And yet there you see the great city mentioned in that verse. But if you'll notice more carefully, Jerusalem is actually described using 4 different terms in that verse. It is called the great city, it is called Sodom, it is called Egypt, and then also the place where Jesus was crucified. Now, the last of those 4 tell us definitively that this is Jerusalem, but the other 3 are clearly euphemistic. I mean, Jerusalem is not Sodom, but it was like Sodom in that day. It's not Egypt, but it was like Egypt in that day. And neither is it the great city, but it was like the great city in that day. So the reference to great city there, similar to the other ones, is simply euphemistic. They're calling it like Babylon, like Sodom, like Egypt. But it's the place where Jesus was crucified so that you don't misunderstand. So the term great city is always a reference to Babylon, whether literally or euphemistically. And now that city becomes the focus for the next 2 chapters in the book of Revelation. In verse 19, we're told that Babylon will receive the cup of wine of God's wrath. Now remember, we've said this before, bowls and cups are, It's commonly used as symbols for the pouring out of wrath, the storing up of wrath to later be poured out upon some deserving object of God's anger, and that is now the fate of Babylon. But the concept of Babylon is exceedingly complex, and that's why it requires 2 chapters to deal with her in Revelation, and that's why it's going to take us a while to get through it, because the destruction of Babylon is one of the 2 major themes of the Bible, the other being the redemption of Christ, the redeeming work of Christ. So the 2 major themes of the Bible are the role and destruction of Babylon and Jesus in his plan of redemption. And those 2 themes play against one another throughout all of Scripture, from Genesis to Revelation. And Babylon, in that sense, serves as the antagonist to Jesus' protagonist in this story of the Bible. Now, just as Jesus' identity was slowly revealed, not fully known until the Gospels, well, similarly, the identity of Babylon is slowly unveiled in Scripture. In fact, the word Babylon in Scripture carries multiple meanings. And I'm going to take you through 5 concepts that are associated with this term right now, all of which are being dealt with in chapters 17 and 18. All right, first, Babylon, going back to the very beginning, Babylon, as it was depicted here in this chapter, is the home of sin, because it is the location of the Garden of Eden in present-day Iraq. In Genesis chapter 2, remembering this, we're told about this garden. Now a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is Pishon. It flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It flows around the whole of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris. It flows east of Assyria. And the 4th river is the Euphrates. All right, so the Garden of Eden is located in the same place as present-day Babylon. And the Garden of Eden was Satan's location for his original attack against God. After he fell from heaven, Ezekiel 28 tells you about that. After he fell from Eden, the garden of God, which was the Eden in heaven, on which the one on the earth is patterned from. Once he fell from the garden of God in Eden, he ended up on the earth. And God made an Eden for man, and presumably Satan became very jealous at the prospect of God creating something in his world, in creation, that could compete with the beauty and the wisdom of Satan. And so he attacks. The jealousy leaves him in a position to go attack man through woman, and you know the story. At the point that Satan gains dominion over the earth at that moment, he does so because Adam chose to obey him instead of God. And in so doing, he effectively worshiped Satan in place of God. Satan then received the dominion that Adam had been given by God. Satan gave his dominion to his new God. So Babylon is ground zero for the start of sin on earth, and it begins the battle between God and Satan in control over the earth. Not a real battle, not one in which there's any doubt in the outcome, but God allows it to continue for a period of history for purposes of his own. So Babylon, ever since that moment, has been Satan's home territory, his stronghold. Literally, geographically, Satan lives there. That's his home. I'm not saying he doesn't move around, but I'm saying that's where his base of operations is. That region continues to be heavily guarded by Satan and his dark forces. Demonic activities especially strong in those areas, and people who go there, I think particularly the men we send in battle over there, come back with demons, many of them. And that is one of the serious consequences of being in that arena. It's a bad place, and when you hear the word Babylon, you need to think of Satan and the beginnings or the origins of sin. That's the first thing you know. Second thing, Babylon was the source of idolatry on earth. Genesis 11 recalls how men gathered in Babylon, under the leadership of a man called Nimrod. Nimrod was the antichrist of his day, which is to say, he was the all-powerful world leader that had command over all of the tribes of the earth in that day. And as such, his story is actually a picture of the Antichrist. And he calls for a new kind of worship in his day, one that will lead mankind into a project, building a tower that they hope will reach to heaven. Now, that goal may seem folly, but it's actually deadly serious, because the Tower of Babel is the start of idolatry among mankind. Because what is idolatry, after all? It is false religion, and like any false religion, it attempts to replace obedience to God with a man-made way to heaven. This just happens to be hyper literal. They're trying to physically move to heaven. But in its form generally and forever after, any kind of idolatry is a replacing of God with something you think gets you to heaven in place of God. And that's what they're doing. They try to reach heaven through mud bricks, and even though it was a foolish act, the heart behind that act was attempting to make their own way to God and believing it was possible. That building, the Tower of Babel, who do you think was behind the idea of it? It's in Satan's backyard, right? Satan used Nimrod to establish the thinking that men could define their own way to heaven. The idea of that started here. And the Lord responded by scattering them, by confusing language, and he did so to ensure that a rebellion like that couldn't get very far. But since that time, with languages being different, men have been put in a position where we fight each other more often than we're working together, and so that's been a governor on the sin of mankind. We can't get too far because we can't get together too easily. Until recent times, Western culture and the internet have increasingly reunited the world under a common language. The pressure and desire to learn English is worldwide now because so much of what people want access to through the internet is in English. And so the world is slowly or quickly now overcoming the barrier of language, and it sets the stage for a new world rebellion against God with the world united under a common language again. The story of the Tower of Babel pictures the story of the Antichrist leading the world at the very end, just as the earlier story did. So when you hear the word Babylon, you need to think source of idolatry, origin of idolatry. Thirdly, Babylon is the Gentile kingdom that conquered the nation of Israel under Nebuchadnezzar and the city of Jerusalem. Now, prior to Nebuchadnezzar, as we learned a few weeks back in our Daniel part of this study, no Gentile nation had ever succeeded in overpowering the people of God. Never had Jerusalem ever been taken before Nebuchadnezzar. God permitted Babylon to do that, to conquer Israel as part of the plan that he had for them. And in that way, Babylon becomes the first of the nations to control Israel, and as such, it starts the age of the Gentiles. And that's what we studied in the book of Daniel. And remember, in that study, we also learned that Nebuchadnezzar, as the head of the statue, pictures who? The Antichrist again. You see a theme? Where Babylon is present in the story and central, you're seeing a picture of what God is going to deal with later when he finally destroys the Antichrist. So God permitted Babylon to conquer Israel, but he also said he would ultimately turn around and deal with Babylon for who it was. At one point in Jeremiah, and this is frequently mentioned in the Old Testament, but here's an example. The Lord says, "But I will repay Babylon and all the inhabitants of Chaldea for all their evil that they have done in Zion before your eyes, declares the Lord." And the times of the Gentiles end in the same way. Remember, we're looking at the end of the age of the Gentiles, when the Antichrist is defeated. You have a single Gentile ruler like Nebuchadnezzar, controlling the entire world, persecuting Israel, controlling Jerusalem, controlling Babylon, just like Nebuchadnezzar. And at the end, God will deal with them, just like Nebuchadnezzar. This will be the Antichrist kingdom, and like the first Babylon, this final Babylon will be used by God to discipline Israel. Just as the beginning of it was God sending Nebuchadnezzar in to show Israel that they had been unfaithful, at the very end, he's using this same technique, one man ruling the world, coming after Israel, so that he can bring them back to himself, which we see later in the study.
All right, going to be carrying on to 53. I hope everybody's doing well this afternoon, or I guess it's almost this evening now, isn't it? God bless.
So, when you hear the word Babylon, you need to think God's instrument to discipline his people. And then fourth, Babylon is the seat of power for the Antichrist during the time of tribulation. Now, some interpreters have argued over whether the Babylon reference in these chapters refers to the actual city, or is it just symbolic? When you get into one of those arguments, it's always funny to me that we have to choose. So often, are the 7 days of creation literal, or are they symbolic? Why are you choosing? They're both. It's literal, and because it's literal, it sets a precedent for what the number 7 means. The 144,000, is it literal or symbolic? It's both. They're literally 144,000, which tells you that God sovereignly chose them because you couldn't have found a perfect number happen by chance. But it's also representative of Israel by virtue of 12 times 12. The point is God always does both. You don't have to pick one. So in this case, Babylon is the literal city, yes, the place on earth that we know it to be today, and by virtue of the name, it invokes all of this history that we're studying. It tells us that God is setting up for a climactic battle between good and evil, Babylon being the poster child for evil, and he's going to destroy it. So, we are, by the way, in the earlier part of chapter 16, we saw that the river Euphrates is central to getting the Antichrist forces to move in that sixth judgment. Well, that's another clear indication we're looking at the literal location. All right, so the seventh bowl judgment is declaring destruction, essentially, against the great city Babylon. Now, the other cities have all been wiped out. Babylon, though, is being singled out for a slow death so that there can be purpose in it, so God can make clear that he's doing something here. He's going to destroy the Antichrist seat of power, as he's established it in Babylon, just before he destroys the Antichrist. And by the way, the fact that the Antichrist has his home in this location makes perfect sense. Where else would it be? There's virtually nothing else left on earth at this point. It's not going to be in Jerusalem, that's for sure. So he picks the place that Satan himself wants because Satan is indwelling him. It's Babylon. So when you hear the word Babylon, you need to think the seat of power in the last days. And then finally, Babylon is the home of the father of lies and the seat of power for the Antichrist during tribulation. And in that sense, it is the center for false religion. It stands for false religion. Babylon does not just represent one specific kind of false religion. All false religious systems that have ever been invented have been invented by Satan. They're all the same. And so when you talk to people in anywhere about religion, and they start telling you that, how do I know that Christianity is the right religion? There's so many out there. How do I know you're the right one? This is what they're seeing in their mind's eye. They're seeing a chart like this of world religions, and the pie slices are so small because there's so many of them, you can't even distinguish them all, right? There's always a new one tomorrow. All right, well, who did that? Well, this is a perfect ploy by Satan because the way he has taken religion and distributed it across so many different systems, he has produced for his own purpose confusion and camouflage. The Lord tells us this is the truth. So only one religion is truly of God. Everything else is false. And at the point where you're distinguishing which one is, which of the false ones you prefer, what difference does it make? So if you don't believe in the Bible, the Jesus of the Bible, the Christianity of the Bible, then you don't believe in what brings you to heaven. Everything else is some version of it. And what Satan has been so good at doing is making it appear as if this smorgasbord of religious choice is testimony to the fact that you can't find just one, or that there is just one. Many false religions are camouflaging the truth, confusing people, making it harder for someone to find what is true, and it perpetuates the myth that there are many roads to heaven. So when you hear the word Babylon, you need to think all false religions. So put all that together and you find that Babylon is both a literal place of importance in the end times, but also the spiritual seat of power for the enemy. It is a physical location where sin began, the spiritual home of Satan and rebellion. It's the starting point for idolatry. It's the source for all hate and opposition against God's people during the age of the Gentiles. Babylon represents all of Satan's false religions and the untold damage that it's done over the millennia. It's come to be representative of everything that Satan is and all that he does to undermine truth and oppose God. Just like you would think a place like Sodom has become a poster child for a certain kind of depravity, or Las Vegas conveys a certain sense of sin or meaning for us today, the term Babylon in Scripture is loaded with these meanings. And as a poster child for Satan and evil, then, Babylon is countered by another city. Jerusalem symbolizes all the opposites of those things in Scripture. It is the city of God and the place of redemption. So Jerusalem is God's dwelling place, the capital of his people, the place of Christ's sacrifice. It's going to be the seat of Christ's government, the center of the world and the kingdom to come. So as Babylon is to Satan, Jerusalem is to Jesus. And as a result of that dichotomy, when you look at Scripture broadly, you find this pattern a lot. Babylon and Jerusalem are always set opposed to one another in Scripture, although that relationship can be hard to see in some cases. Generally, it's expressed in terms of cardinal direction. So you have Babylon in the east and Jerusalem in the west. Notice they're almost exactly opposite each other in compass direction even. They're not quite at the same longitude, or latitude, but they're similar. And as you go through Scripture, you find this interesting pattern over and over again. Babylon being east of Jerusalem, east becomes a representation of evil. And Jerusalem, being west, becomes a representation of moving away from evil and toward the Lord. So, for example, Adam was created. And if you pay attention to the text, it says that after he was created, the Lord put him in a garden that was in the east, which means the Lord moved him from west to east, symbolizing or representing Adam moving towards sin, to a place where he would discover sin. Later, Cain, after he kills his brother, is sent from the west to the east. Abraham was found in the east, in Ur, and sent west to the promised land, which obviously insinuates his move from paganism to faith. Jesus moved from the west side of the Jordan to the east to meet Satan in his temptations in the wilderness. The Israelites moved from the east side of the Jordan to the west side of the Jordan when they came into the promised land. And this pattern happens over and over and over again. In fact, if you look carefully at east and west references throughout the whole of the Scripture, they're not always necessarily following this pattern, but they almost always do. And you'll see it as a clear indication. It's a subtext. It's a little note to the reader. There's something evil going on or something good going on, versus, depending on which direction you're talking about. Now, this pattern has happened time and time again. But in the climactic point of the age of the Gentiles, here we are at the second half of the tribulation, right at the very end of tribulation. What starts to happen is the figurative becomes the literal. The world has reached the point where there is nowhere else. Apart from the space in that map, the rest of the world doesn't exist. It's uninhabitable, it's destroyed. All that's left are two cities, the two that have always ever mattered, the two that represent all of what has happened in the history of the world. They've just now become not just figurative examples, they've become the literal reality. And so God plays out the final battle between these two cities in the literal to re-emphasize or to make clear the spiritual background for both. So we're going to actually watch the east come to the west to battle them in a gigantic end-of-the-world war, which has got a predetermined outcome because God's going to win it. We know that, but it's still interesting to watch it play out. All right, so these tribulation judgments being the final wrath of God, the end of his wrath, as we've been told, they must bring an end to Babylon, not just in the literal of the city, but everything I just listed on that prior slide has to be dealt with. Think about it in these terms. At the end of the tribulation, Jesus comes back. He reigns over a world that is in perfect submission to him. He rules with a rod of iron. No one will challenge his rule. If that's to be true, then none of those things that Babylon represents can still have any life in the kingdom. They can't still be around. They can't still be making an impact. They can't still be influencing people because Jesus is going to be there to not allow it. So in the preparation of his return, he sets up the circumstances on earth so that at his return, he can wipe out all of that in one fell swoop. And in order to do that, he has to move some pieces around on the board, get some things done in advance so that when he comes back, it's not a messy cleanup at that point. It's just a simple operation. And that's what you're watching happen now. The end of Babylon is the end of all the evil in the world as it's constituted in Satan and his works. And it comes to a head with Jesus' second coming. So you're seeing now at the very outset of chapter 17, the seventh bowl judgment's effect on Babylon, the great city, bringing it to its end. It comes in two forms, though. We got to get rid of the physical city itself, the headquarters of the antichrist, the place where he's currently holed up with his army and his forces. But we also have to put an end to the spiritual Babylon. That is, we have to get rid of idolatry in all its forms, false religion, anything that competes with worship of Christ. Certainly we have to get rid of their proponents, the false prophet, the antichrist himself, Satan at the top of the chain. All of that's got to be put away before we get into the kingdom. So we see it happen in two chapters. Chapter 17 is God judging spiritual Babylon, and then chapter 18 is God judging the physical city of Babylon. And between those two chapters, he puts an end to all false religion and its control. And he, ironically, uses the father of lies, Satan himself, to accomplish that. And then when it comes time to destroy the city, he eliminates it as a seat of military and financial power in the last days and robs it of its wealth and its prestige. All right, so now we're going to see the first of those, the judgment against spiritual Babylon in chapter 17. And we're going to read it in several large chunks, starting with just 3 verses, though. First, verse 1. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me and said, "Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality. Those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness and saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, and I saw a woman, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered greatly. And the angel said to me, why do you wonder? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to come up out of the abyss and go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will wonder when they see the beast that he was and is not and will come. All right. This is one of the most curious areas of the whole book of Revelation. People are always running to this area and just imagining all manner of things. We'll just do our homework and we'll be fine. So the angel tells John, we're going to give you more insight into the 7th bowl judgment. Now, all the bowl judgments have come now, and yet we're still in the middle of this narrative. Why? Well, because that last bowl judgment, it's like one of those Rube Goldberg, is that the name of the guy? The guy that makes those little interesting contraptions that kind of run on their own for a while? It's like one of those. Somebody just kicked a little marble off the top of the ledge in the 7th bowl judgment, and now it's all just going to play out. And what John's getting is the detail of how that works. And the angel introduces the scene in verses 1 and 2 just by describing a certain woman who he calls a harlot who sits on many waters. And if you go down to verse 5, you notice that the harlot is a symbol for the great city Babylon. So that's given to us right there in the context. And the rule of this great city is over the kings of the earth. Now, women are commonly used in the Bible as a symbol of religious systems. You have Israel as the wife of Jehovah. You have the church as the bride of Christ. So this is a common way of using a woman, that is to symbolize religious systems. So we've already said we're talking about spiritual Babylon here, not the city, but the concept of all that has come out of that region with what Satan has done and what he has promulgated around the earth. So you have a harlot picturing spiritual Babylon, and it's because a harlot is a perfect representation of false religion. I mean, think about it. A harlot or a prostitute, it's an illegitimate, counterfeit wife. And as such, it gives the illusion of marriage and the comforts of marriage without the substance or the reality of marriage. And in the same way, a harlot is a perfect picture of idolatry. It's a false religious relationship that is pretending to be like the real relationship you have through a covenant in faith with Jesus. So more than just picturing idolatry, John is told that this woman, the great city of Babylon, isn't just a picture of idolatry. She's the mother of all prostitutes in this regard, the mother of all false religion. So this goes back to what we said earlier. Babylon is where it all started. It's where the idea of worshiping other things got going. And as such, it is the source of all false religion, the beginning of all counterfeits, confirmation of what we observed earlier. And Satan, being the author of all lies, is the one who is producing all of these counterfeits. And his home, being Babylon, means Babylon becomes the personification of false religion, because that's where his home is, and he's the author of them. So, the harlot rides a beast. We'll get back to that. She is spiritual Babylon, false religion. If you just want to take everything we've learned about spiritual Babylon and give it a title that kind of helps you understand it better, the harlot is false religion and all that comes from it. And She sits on many waters. Now, the meaning of the many waters is explained in verse 15. Here again, we get our answer right in the text. Water represents the multitude of the nations and the peoples of the world, all humanity, in other words. And you'll look down your page, you'll see it there. So we're building an image here. This woman, false religion, sits on water, suggesting she is over them. She is dominating them. So the world is under the deception of false religion, which finds its source in Babylon, the home of Satan. None of this should be a surprise to you. If I told you that world religions are all coming from Satan and he's fooling the world by them, that's not news, right? Okay, well, it just said that. Then the angel says the world leaders fornicate with her, and the peoples become drunk in her immorality. Now, the enemy is enticing people to engage in the worship of false gods for all kinds of fleshly reasons. But what this text is saying is, throughout time, leaders, world leaders, have turned to false religion to build a base of power, to enrich themselves, to control subjects, and in some cases, as true believers, thinking that they're appealing to some God who can bring them even greater power in their role as a leader. In that sense, they fornicate, they enjoy, if you will, the harlot. They use her for their own pleasure and become partners with her in that respect. And they become drunk. People become drunk by her immorality in the sense that what false religion says is okay will appeal to the flesh of those who follow it, and so they become excited by it and addicted to it. And so false religion, you can see it in two ways. It is both a sedative and a stimulant. It's a stimulant of the lust in the form of power and desires of all kinds, greed and the like. People tell you they're doing it for pious and selfless reasons, but never is that true with false religion. It's always a selfish pursuit. By definition, it is a worship of self, because it is of a God you designed, you chose, you made for yourselves. So it is a stimulant in that regard, but it's also a sedative because it sedates the mind. It lulls a person into spiritual stupor. It inoculates them from the truth. It satisfies some part of them that knows that they should see their true God, find the true God, but they stop looking. Paul says this in 2 Corinthians 4:3, even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving so that they may not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is in the image of God. All right, so that's just the intro. Let's get to verse 3. John now is taken to a wilderness, it says, to see this harlot in a new form. And in the wilderness, John sees a woman riding a beast full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, some of this should sound really familiar to you, right? Remember back in 13 when we saw the beast. 12 was the dragon, 13 was the beast. Okay, remember in 13:1, the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having, there they are, 10 horns, 7 heads. On his horns were 10 diadems, on his heads were blasphemous names. Now, we said back then that the beast was the antichrist, and in verse 8 here, you see confirmation that he's the antichrist, because it says he is the one who was, is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss to his destruction. That's a reference to what? He was, he wasn't, then he was again. This is resurrection, right, which we saw happen at mid-trib. So this becomes a classic way of describing the Antichrist from this point forward. He is the one who was not, and it comes up again. All right? So we know that this beast is the Antichrist, as was the case in chapter 13. And it says, when the world sees that he was and was not and was again, they will marvel over him. Here again, what we learned at mid-trib. The whole world is worshiping this guy. All right? So start building in your mind's eye here these pictures of the images and how they relate. You have a beast, and who was on the beast? The harlot, the woman. The woman represents false religion, as Satan has designed it. The beast now represents, at this point in the text, the person of the Antichrist in the false, in his role, leading the world at the end of tribulation. He's now being ridden by the harlot. She's in scarlet and purple and adorned richly. So we know that false religion existed long before the Antichrist came around. In fact, look earlier, you notice earlier she was seen sitting on the waters of the world, right? So those waters of the world, the people of the world, the kings that were fornicating with her, that was an earlier time. Now you see her riding only the beast. So what you need to imagine in the way that John has seen this, she's moved from a position over the world to just being on one man, which is a way of explaining that there's been a change here as we come to the end of tribulation. That now Babylon rides the harlot, Babylon, who is the harlot, rides the beast, because Satan is indwelling the antichrist. And as such, spiritual Babylon, the mother of all idolatry, the one that Satan gave birth to, if you will, has now been united with one man, and that one man is also the world leader of the world. So there is no other leader to sit on. This has all come together in a point. One man, Satan, the mother of all harlots, everything that is evil in the world, concentrated in one moment, a woman on a beast. All right?
Okay, and that was 53, so we are on to 54. How's everybody doing today? And here we go. God bless.
Which means at the end of tribulation, all world religion is vested in one man, the Antichrist. No longer are there a cornucopia of false religions. That pie chart has gone to one color, virtually. That is to say, the world only knows the beast and all are worshiping him. So in that sense, the harlot and the beast ride on. And she's clothed in royal clothing, adorned with riches, and that's because Satan is requiring the world now to worship him and to make sacrifice to him and to adorn him with their sacrifices. Do you remember what Daniel told us when we were studying back in chapter 11 for a brief time when we were looking at the Antichrist? We learned this about the Antichrist. This king, the Antichrist, will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. But instead, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stone, and treasures. That's the woman adorned so nicely with all those treasures. That's picturing this thing going on in the world. All right? But she is also assured judgment because it says she holds a cup of abominations and immorality and that she is going to drink these things. That is, she will ultimately pay for them. So, verse 6, John hears that she is drunk on the blood of the saints, which is a picture of the martyrdom that's taking place not only now in the tribulation, but has always happened. And in that sense, this scene is telling the story of religion from all times. That is, Satan's tool to enslave the world is false religion. He brings with it all manner of sin, and the world lavishes their desires onto it. And in the meantime, it persecutes the true religion because Satan knows who his true enemy is. So there's one religion, two if you want to count Judaism for the time being, that are always on the out, and the world is always celebrating something else. This is spiritual Babylon, the system of lies and corruption that Satan promulgates throughout history. And in the final days, his scheme is vested in a single man, and John is giving us now an explanation of how this coming together of Satan and his plans, and the Antichrist and his plans, and God above all, and his plans to bring the age of the Gentiles to an end, how do they all come together? And the answer is explained here in connection with Daniel 7. All right, first, I want you to remember what we studied back in chapters 12 and 13. Let's just build a picture here, because this is where the complexity happens. If you want to sleep through this part, you might as well just leave now, because you're not going to get anything else. All right, remember we studied the beast and the dragon from 12 and 13. All right, the dragon had 10 horns and 10 heads with crowns. That represented Satan controlling the whole of the world. Remember, at this time, the world has 10 kingdoms. As we come into the tribulation, there's only 10 kingdoms with 10 kings. And Satan has all of them. He's in charge of the world. He's got dominion of the world. All the kingdoms represented by the by the horns. And then he's got all of the kings represented by the heads with the crowns on them. Everybody owes their allegiance to Satan. But then we went to the beast in chapter 13, and the beast had 10 horns, and but only 7 heads, and the crowns were on the horns. You see the difference up there, right? And we didn't cover it back then because I told you we'd get to it now. So what does that symbology for the beast mean? It's the same as what we're seeing here in 17. But here in 17, we get the explanation. Verse 9 is coming next. So, by the way, I also mentioned in the beast case, the seventh one was dead and then resurrected. Remember, that was also given to us in chapter 13. So we see that again here too. So of the beast's heads, there's only 7, not 10. One of them has died and resurrected, which would mean it actually pictures the Antichrist himself personally. But now you end up with this strange recursiveness because you have the beast representing the Antichrist, but one of the heads represents the Antichrist also. And that's where it gets confusing. So now we have to sort it out. Verse 9. Here's the mind which has wisdom. Oh, Lord, yes, we need it right here. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain a little while. The beast, which was and is not, is himself also an 8th, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one purpose. They give their power and authority to the beast. These will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are the called and the chosen and faithful. All right. Trust me, we're going to get through this. When it says to those who have a mind with wisdom, what the Bible means when it says to those who have wisdom, it means this. It's not just saying, are you extra smart? It's saying, do you know history? And more importantly, do you know the rest of the Bible? To have wisdom means to know the Bible. That's what it means in this context. So we have to know something of things we've already learned, from Daniel particularly. Let's start with what we have on the page. First, we have the heads are mountains. Right? So this is the beast again, right? We just learned that those 7 heads are mountains, and that the mountains themselves are pictures or symbols of world rulers. That was all given to us right there in the text. Why did the text go from heads to mountains to rulers? Why didn't it just say rulers? Why have that intermediate symbol? Well, the reason is so that you know these 7 are to be distinguished from the 7 kings who rule with the Antichrist during the time of tribulation. Because we know there are 7 of these guys left. There were 10. Remember, 3 were killed when the Antichrist was resurrected. We've heard that, so we know there's a 7 out there associated with kings. And you get to this point and you think 7 heads must be the 7 kings, but you'd be wrong. And in order to make sure you know that that's wrong, he takes the step of calling them mountains, because a mountain in the Bible stands for the highest authority, a king of highest authority. You wouldn't have the Antichrist and 7 other guys all of equal authority. So these 7 kings cannot be the 7 kings under the Antichrist, because they are 7 kings of high authority. Furthermore, we're told that the harlot will sit on these 7 kings. Now remember, we learned earlier the woman is sitting on kings of the earth, but yet once the Antichrist comes to power, she only sits on the beast. So if these were the other 7 kings of that day of tribulation, you can't have her sitting on all 7 of them. She only sits on the one that's in charge. So that would rule this out as the 7 kings of tribulation. Then in verse 10, we're also told that 5 of these 7 kings have fallen by the time of John's day. So you have her sitting on one of them, the 7th one, which is the one that represents the Antichrist. 5 of the earlier ones have already gone by the time John was writing this. That's what the angel means when he says 5 are gone. He's saying, John, as of our time here, 1st century, as we sit here, 5 are already gone. And he says 1 is in the 1st century, and 1 is yet to come, and that one that will come is the one that will be and not be and be again, which is the Antichrist. So these 7 rulers don't all rule at the same time. They are sequential. One comes, then another one later, finally ending with the Antichrist. So these are not the 7 of tribulation. These are 7 other guys. Later in verse 16, you're told that the 10 horns represent the kings of tribulation. Look down your book there. So in verse 16, so if the 10 horns, the ones that are over here on the left with the crowns on them, they represent the 10 kings that were on the earth at the time of the Antichrist's rise to power. So that's where the 10 kings are, not 7 but 10. So these other 7 guys are some totally different group of people. All right, so that's where we now have to understand what we're looking at here. So the 7 heads on the beast are different kings. And as we said earlier, verse 10 also tells us that the beast himself is one of these 7, which means he's a successor to the earlier kings. And when he comes to power, we're told he will reign for only a little while. That's a reference to his 3.5-year reign at the second half of tribulation. And so these kings rule one after another, not at the same time. Verse 11, that is really where it gets confusing. Not only is he one of the 7, as you see here with the woman on top of him, but he's also an 8th. How is that? Well, look in verse 11 where we're told that. What else are we told in verse 11? Not only are we told he's one of the 8, but we're also told that he was and is not, and we know that he comes back again. That's another reference to his resurrection, and in that sense he's an 8th, because he was the 7th until he died, and after he died and resurrected, it's effectively he's an 8th now. That's the sense of it, okay? So you have the 7th becoming an 8th, and she just moves over wherever he is, right? She's on him through the tribulation. He is the only king that matters. All right, so now we're still not sure why all this was given to us. We still need to go a little further. To understand the meaning of the heads, we need to go back to chapter 13 and take a note of one important detail. Verse 2. Notice how this beast, same beast, we've already established that the beast of 13 and the beast of 17, same beast, they got the same number of horns, same number of heads, everything's the same. The difference is in 13 we see his arrival, and in 17 we find out what's going on behind the scenes spiritually. He's actually being ridden by Babylon, spiritual Babylon. But look at what we learned about him in chapter 13, verse 2. He was like a leopard, his feet were like those of a bear, his mouth was like that of a lion, the dragon had given him his power. All right, remember all those references to animals? What did that tell us back then? That this beast we're seeing here in chapter 13 now and in chapter 17 incorporate aspects of all 4 of the beasts that Daniel gave us in the age of the Gentiles. All right, so now stay with me for a second. You have the age of the Gentiles, which is a period of history, starting with Nebuchadnezzar, ending with the Antichrist. It goes through 4 major stages, and the 4 stages were represented in Daniel 7 by these beasts, these different animals. The last of the 4 was the beast with the 10 horns. So when I look at the beast of chapter 13 and of chapter 17, I find elements of all 4 of those animals. You got bear, leopard, lion, and the horns, which represent the 4th beast. So what is that saying? Well, we know that during the 2,600 plus years that this age has been going on, there have been a lot more than 7 rulers, right? We know that. So somewhere in that span of history, you have a beast that's made up of bits and parts from all of them. So that's a way of saying this beast represents this entire age, of which you have major players, 7 major players, the last of which is the beast, the man who personifies it all, the Antichrist. But he didn't start it, he ends it. It started with Nebuchadnezzar, and it moves through stages. And these heads represent men who were in leadership during that time, who carry us from the beginning to the end, who represent God's work in this age to accomplish his purpose, and this beast has the harlot on it the whole way. So Satan is working through this period of history as God has appointed him to bring about the end of the world in stages, now leading into the last stage of tribulation. Everyone wants to know who the 7 are, and it's not hard to figure them out, because you just have to follow the rules we established when we studied this back in Daniel. First of all, of the 7, 5 are fallen. 5 had to be dead by the 1st century. And then 1 had to be alive in John's day, around AD 95. That narrows it down. And then we know who the last one is. The last one is the Antichrist. All right? So, knowing that there's a connection between Daniel and this chapter, we understand it's always been between Babylon and Jerusalem. That's always been the issue. Babylon being destroyed at the end, but Babylon destroying Jerusalem at the beginning. The beginning of the age of the Gentiles was Babylon destroying Jerusalem, and the end of the age of the Gentiles is going to be Jerusalem destroying Babylon, figuratively speaking, right? Spiritually speaking. So the age of the Gentiles is ultimately a battle between good and evil in which God controls the whole of it. He initiates it with evil winning for a while and good winning in the end, but for the good purpose of disciplining his people and opening an opportunity for the church to receive the gospel and everything else we talked about in those earlier periods of the study. All right, so if you remember, we said when we went to decide which four kingdoms were the four represented by those beasts, we said they had to follow a simple rule or series of rules. They had to control Babylon. They had to destroy Jerusalem or control Jerusalem, and they had to be Gentile. And they had to replace the earlier kingdom. And that led us to the four that we know now are the four of the age. Apply those same rules to the leaders. That is, look for supreme rulers, mountains, supreme kings, who ruled over Jerusalem and Babylon and had died by the time John wrote the book of Revelation. History records 5. Nebuchadnezzar's dynasty over Babylon began it. And by the way, you don't count the guys between changes. I don't count all of them in the period of Babylon. I'm still looking at the divisions of the age of the Gentiles. So when I leave one of those divisions, I'm looking for when there's a change, or is there a change in the middle? I'll show you what I mean as we go. So Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon controlled it for a time, until Cyrus's Persia controlled it for a time, until Alexander's Greek Empire controlled them for a time. But remember, Alexander's Greek Empire did not remain monolithic like the first two did. The first two stayed monolithic. Yes, there was a succession of rulers, but it was effectively just a dynasty, a handing off from one family member to the next. But once you got to the end of Alexander's life, there was no dynasty. He had no kids. They broke it into 4 parts at that point. Which one, if any of them, had both Jerusalem and Babylon? Guess what? None of them did. That is, of the 4 places, the 4 parts of the Greek Empire that were divided up after Alexander's death, Babylon was in one and Jerusalem was in another. So they were not controlled at all times by the same king. But there were 2 times during the period of the Greek Empire in which internal battles took place and one king was able to take both territories for a period of time. It happened first with Ptolemy, the Seleucid Empire retaining control of Babylon, and then the Ptolemaic had Jerusalem, and then Ptolemy III, who was of the Ptolemaic kingdom, attacked the Seleucid Empire in 246 BC, I guess, and that's when he had both. And then later in 170 BC, who was it? I think it was Antiochus, right, who did that? Antiochus of the Seleucid Empire attacked the Ptolemaic Empire. I didn't have his name in my notes. I was trying to remember. So those are, we count those 2 guys, even though they're all part of what we consider the leopard, because they were not the original kingdom. This is a new supreme leader attacking and taking control, and he set a new precedent. Between those heads, there was no one. That's the point. There's only 5 guys that move through time and do what's required to meet the terms of the age of the Gentiles. There was nobody else who made that conquest happen. And then you reach the time of John, and who was currently in power in John's day, who had become the first of the Romans to take both. The first Roman to take Jerusalem in conquest was Titus, to conquer and destroy the city as had been done like Nebuchadnezzar. And after Titus, no one has ever done both. No one has ever done both. No king has ever ruled over both. Now, the Ottomans came in for a time and they controlled the land, but they didn't take, there was no Jerusalem at the time, or they didn't take both Jerusalem and Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon at the same time. And so the Roman Empire ends with the 7th, which is the one we've talked about. All right. So the 7 kings are kings who lead Satan's kingdom, this spiritual Babylon, during the time of the age of the Gentiles. The harlot rides them through the history of the age of the Gentiles, eventually landing on the final one, the antichrist. The kings were all her benefactors. The harlot was an enabler. Satan ruled the world by deception and lies and greed and lust. But in tribulation, all those relationships get a lot clearer and closer. And then you have the 10 horns, as we said already. They represent the 10 kings who lead the world at the start of tribulation. And we come back to them just to make the point that it says they have one purpose. And this confirms what we learned in Daniel earlier. Why did God let the world get down to just 10 kings at the very end before the Antichrist showed up? It's for this reason, that they would give their authority to the beast. It's a lot easier for 10 guys to be ruled by one man than 250 nations. So the Lord consolidates nations into just 10 for this purpose, that when the time comes, the Antichrist can rise above all of them, ultimately so that they can all be brought to their end. All right, with the last bit of tonight, let's just look at the end of the book, the end of 17, rather. He said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. We said that earlier. And the 10 horns which you saw and the beast, these will hate the harlot and will make her desolate and naked and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. For God has put in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose, by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. The woman who you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. All right, this is what you just learned. This is the heart of the judgment against spiritual Babylon. During the age of the Gentiles, God puts Satan's counterfeit religious system to work for his own purposes in disciplining Israel. That's what we just studied in the age of the Gentiles. God lets Satan do what he does, but he controls it to the purpose of disciplining Israel. Now that he's reached the point where he doesn't want him anymore, he sends the seventh bowl judgment, and it brings an end to his corrupt counterfeit religious system. Because in verses 16 and 17, we're told that the Antichrist and the world rulers all come to hate the harlot. That's interesting, isn't it? Why would they suddenly hate what they've always previously loved? Well, think about what's happened at mid-trib. At mid-trib, Satan indwells Antichrist. He directs all the world to worship him now. Now, ironically, as Satan has indwelled a man and made himself the object of their worship, he's now competing with his own false religions, which he previously populated the world with, that's not going to make him happy. So he then goes about systematically ending worship of anything except himself in this new form. And so all religious institutions, temples, churches, mosques, any place of religious worship is destroyed. That's what it means here when it says they're burned with fire and they eat the flesh of the harlot. The flesh of the harlot symbolically is the structure of all of that religion. It's all being torn down. So all religious institutions are stripped of their wealth. She is made desolate and naked. The angel says, verse 17, the kings are working in this regard to fulfill God's purpose, even though they think it's their own idea. I love this verse for a lot of reasons. It just goes to show that we think that if God is in control of us, we must be robots. You're not giving God enough credit. He can control you and you have no idea. You think it's your own idea. And he's doing it here with evil people. He can do it with believers. He's always doing it for good. The point is he can do it. And in this case, he has turned these people to thinking, this would be good for us. We should destroy all these religions. We don't want them anymore. And Satan's in the middle of that saying, yes, get rid of all these other religions. What are they doing? They're cleaning up their own mess for God. Because at Christ's return, he won't have to destroy mosques and false houses of worship the world over. They're all gone. Because Satan did it for him. And in verse 14, then we're told Jesus will take care of Satan and the Antichrist and the false prophet by himself. So after they're the last three standing, that's all Christ needed done. He comes back and takes care of them. So the seventh judgment greatly simplifies the problem of cleansing the world of false religion prior to Christ's second coming. God makes Satan do it for him, so that at his second coming, he only need destroy one man and the power behind him. All right, that's how the end of the spiritual Babylon happens. Let's just look at one last slide. So at the end of the spiritual Babylon's destruction, the end of the seventh judgment, all of this structure that had been in place and had been ruling the world comes to this. All that's left is one man ruling the world as the leader and the spiritual leader, and now it's a mano a mano, one against one, not even a fair fight, but still, the Lord comes back with one man now to fight. Now that's all in preparation for the rest of the military battles. We'll do the city next time we meet in a few weeks.
Okay, and we just finished up 54. We will move along to 55. Actually, it looks like we've dipped down. I think I'm gonna call it for today, or at least for right now. I might hop on later and do this again, but my kids are out playing in the sunshine and I want to go spend some time with them. But God bless all of you, and we will catch up the last 5 of these before next Tuesday for the regular live stream. God bless.